Collins on Friday. And the first thing that I heard is, oh, this is all stuff that we knew before. And I was pretty disappointed because I thought the message at the end of that meeting was that, yes, we knew all of this before, but we have to have a different approach to it that's around being community-focused and evidence-based. So it was like a foundation or a level setting for everyone so that we could go about our work differently. So I was disappointed, but not really, because I listen to it every week and I've learned how they kind of just, you know, it's a big picture and it's a radio show. I mean, it is just that. But we've got to do the big work. And I think that the Safe Communities Committee is going to do that dive. But if we need to talk about that, we'll try to figure out a way to talk about it today. But right now, we have some other major things that we haven't spent the time of data analytics on. Particularly our strategies around transportation and mobility, our strategies for financing, what we're going to be doing around sports and entertainment, all of those things that we need to talk about. And then the final thing I was going to say, I don't know who wrote all of the staff briefing papers, the pre-reads, but they were a wealth of information. They were really well done, and I say thank you. I'm going to need to be able to read them a little bit more. I may not, there can't be a test on it today, guys. I don't know who put it together, but no test today. We're doing a lot of work, and it showed in that pre-briefing work. So I want to thank the manager and the team for putting that together. So with that, I'm done. Any questions, any comments, any suggestions for the day? Temperature's good. So with that, who do I turn it over to? Mr. Joe?
Thank you, Mayor. So in the next few minutes before I turn it over to David, what I'd like to do is thank you, and I know you're saying, why is he thanking us for an annual strategy meeting? And I use that term, not a retreat, but an annual strategy meeting, because what this does for us is that you establish goals and we're able to implement during the year. With that level of understanding what's important to you, it makes it so much easier for us. So what I'd like to do, and I think Julia Martin is in the room, is give you a couple of documents that show your hard work at the 2018 annual strategy meeting as well as the 2019 annual strategy meeting. Now, strong desires that same type of blueprint will happen through this meeting. I'll use Councilmember Winston for an example, and it's much like a playbook. Thinking about putting the playbook together, and we're able, over the course of the year, to implement the plays. And Councilmember Graham, over the course of the last week, I've heard him say big things, and we await those. And it's amazing. I think the mayor has already renamed the meeting from Moving Charlotte Forward, Building a Connected Charlotte, to Go Big. Okay, so from a staff perspective, we're ready for that. We welcome that. In terms of the 2018 annual strategy meeting, you'll see that there were a number of short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals, and what we have is somewhat of a report card against those. Our strong desire is, again, for the 2020 annual strategy meeting, is to have that same short, medium, and long-term perspective around the priorities that the council will come up with over the course of the next few days. In terms of the 2019 annual strategy meeting, we really have some of what I would call the unfinished business, and I believe Councilmember Winston asked this during the Budget and Effectiveness Committee meeting that Councilmember Driggs chairs, and that is, what are some of the things that were asked and not completed? So that's a tough pill to swallow for a city manager to come to you today and give you a number of to-be-determined items. But we want to make sure we don't do that next year. We are going to come back to you quarterly and report progress as it relates to anything that comes out of the annual strategy meeting. So with that said, that's much of the playbook for us. What we would love to get out of the meeting, as well as our commitment to you to continue to work the plan from 2018, the plan from 2019, the plan that comes out today. And I believe, Jason, we kicked off the 2019 annual strategy meeting with a video. Is there by chance just maybe something in your back pocket that just maybe a little something that you could queue up to get us started? Maybe. Maybe. It's all yours, David.
So thank you, sir. All right. So by way of introduction, my name is David Phillips. I'll be your facilitator for the next 2.5 days. I run an innovation consulting and training firm in Charlotte called Faster Glass. And what we do primarily is help people and organizations learn how to see and think differently so they are then better equipped to accomplish whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. And I bring that up because this idea of seeing differently, and particularly being the year 2020, it's kind of an obvious pun there, there's some things that I want to share with you very briefly to help set the tone. We call it sharpening the axe. It's from an Abraham Lincoln quote. You may know this, where he said, if I were given 8 hours to chop down a tree, I would spend the first 6 sharpening the axe. So preparing to be successful. Because as the mayor said, the work you do throughout the year, but particularly when you have this much time together in a strategic retreat, a strategic planning session, big things come out of this and big opportunities. But those opportunities can be lost as well if we're not really paying attention. So with that said, I want to share with you 3 framing questions we have found to be invaluable for any group of people trying to accomplish big things. And what we know and what you already know from the world of learning, you want stuff to stick, you write it down. It's one thing to hear, it's another thing to write it. So I'm going to strongly encourage you to write these things down. You ready? Number one is this. What is the problem? Write that down. Number 1, what is the problem? You decide how you want to emphasize it. What is the problem? What is the problem? What is the problem? But that's critical, right? Again, you know this. In fact, everything I'm going to share with you right now is stuff you already know. I just want to make it top of mind. You've got that down? Great, scratch through it. That's actually not a very good question. There's a better question, and it's this. What are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to accomplish is a much better framing question than what is the problem, and here's why. For some of us, when we're presented with a problem, we get locked in solving that problem. And sometimes that leads us to solving the wrong problem. So if instead we ask, what are we trying to accomplish, it allows us to zoom out and kind of broaden our frame, broaden our focus to make sure we don't, to help us ensure we don't solve the wrong, we don't spend a lot of time solving the wrong problem. So that's number 1, what are we trying to accomplish? Number 2, And I'm not going to do that scratch out thing anymore. It only works once. After that, it's just annoying or more annoying. Number 2 is how might we? And that language is very, very specific. It's not how could we, nor is it how should we. It's how might we, because the word might implies possibility. Again, from a framing perspective, it broadens your solution set. How might we solve for X? If my car won't start because the battery's dead, if I get locked into solving for a dead battery, my solution set is very, very limited. Right? I could jump it, I could replace it, I could call AAA to come help me. But if instead I ask, what am I trying to accomplish? If I'm trying to get to work, my solution set's a lot bigger. I could walk, I could take the bus, I could get an Uber, I could skateboard, I could moonwalk. But how might we allows us to think more broadly, or, as I just heard, to think big or bigger. The last question is this: what else? So now you think of this as a sequence. What are we trying to accomplish? How might we? And then what else? What else simply ensures that we don't stop at the first good answer, or in your case, the first good goal we come to. Because what are the odds the first solution, the first goal you come to is the best one? What else at least forces you to think, ooh, that's a really good idea, but what else might be good, maybe an even better idea that we won't find if we don't look for it? So what are we trying to accomplish? How might we, and what else? And if that language is not already part of your toolbox, I think if you find incorporating that just in your conversations with one another today and tomorrow and Wednesday and beyond, I think you'll find them valuable. The second thing is this, again, because you are thinking big, and this just goes back to human nature, we're all human, is that don't let what you know, because you know a lot, especially those who have been on the council for a while, and even those of you who are new to council, you still know a lot. But don't let what you know limit what you can imagine. Don't let what you know limit what you can imagine. Because it's really easy to get locked in and start hammering around, well, this is what I know we can do. The last 3 things are really just more administrative in nature. You've got Post-it notes and Sharpies at your table. When we start going through the exercises, we're asking you to capture things. I'm going to strongly encourage you to write on the Post-it notes with the Sharpies for a couple of reasons. 1, if we don't capture it, it's like it never happened. 2, by putting your ideas, your questions, your concerns, your goals, your what have you on Post-it notes, it allows us to then, as we process this information, and we're going to do it together, allows us to move things around, to cluster ideas, to rank them, to rate them, and so forth. And doing it with a Sharpie ensures that it's readable. It also forces you to be concise. It's hard to write a paragraph with a Sharpie, right? But it also makes it more readable. When we take pictures of this and type this up, just to make sure we can read it, get it back to you. You already know this. We have a timed agenda. All the different segments are time boxed. But those are always estimates. Here's how much we think, here's how much time we think is sufficient for this particular segment. And of course, there's no way we can always get that exactly right. With that said, anytime we go over, then it means we got to take away time from something else. And I won't always know. In fact, I can't know when you're on a conversation that's worth continuing and when we need to pull the plug. So what I will do is ask, like, hang on, is this worth continuing? And I need you guys to weigh in, because otherwise, again, it's the opportunity cost of continuing this means we got to give something else up. And lastly, you already know this, and I'm looking for Katie to validate this. When council members are speaking at the tables, click the mic to record, click it to turn off, on, off. You know the drill. This is nothing new. All right, that's it. Are we ready to be successful? Are we ready for a successful retreat? Awesome. Then let's do this. And if I'm not mistaken, let me check because I often am. We are already ahead of schedule. Can you dig it? I'm sorry, we are already behind schedule. I misspoke. We got to catch up. No, we are already ahead of schedule. So the first thing on our agenda is for each of the council members to, you've got 5 minutes or so, to simply stand up, take the mic, and share with your colleagues what are the big things on your mind, right? What are your big goals? What do you want to accomplish, right, as a member of the council? And to just give you a quick preview, so however you articulate that is completely up to you. Then we'll take a short break, and then after that, we're going to ask you to categorize those goals on different time horizons. And so we're going to need to do that with those magical Post-it notes and Sharpies. So as you're thinking about how you're articulating your goals as council members, either as you're doing it, before you do it, or during the break, capture those things individually on Post-it notes. It's one discrete item, one discrete goal, one discrete question per note, again, so we can move things around, group them, cluster them, what have you.
Mayor, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Your mic is turned off.
Okay. It's red. What am I supposed to do? Why would I do that? Okay. Last year we had some confusion about the big buckets, and we limited it to 3. And under the big buckets, there were a number of initiatives, strategies, programs that all needed to either be studied, funded, or, you know, some of them didn't happen because they didn't rise to the top after the strategic effort was written down. I just wanted to make sure we were all good on that this year before, and just make sure that we don't have any like confusion that the things underneath the line would be done for review, but things above the line were the things that we wanted to accomplish overall as a goal.
Absolutely. And again, just as a peek ahead, just a quick go around the room, what are your goals for the year? Then we're going to start to categorize these things across time horizons. And then late this afternoon, the last thing we'll do is around then themes. So what are the themes that emerge from your goals? We already have 5 buckets, 5 themes in our back pocket. If they fit those, great. If there are others, great. We'll see where we go. But then back to your point, to make sure that we understand where we're headed and how we make the most of this information. So with that said, oh great, now we're behind. I'm just kidding, we're not behind. Who would like to start? And so you can just use your mic. Actually, you go ahead and stand up. Let's do this. Or Stephanie, you tell me, what's easier for you? Does it matter?
Just as long as I can hear it, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
My big above-the-line one would be to invest in our bus system to make it more efficient and connect people on a more timely basis. Get more people to use the bus.
Okay. So think of, obviously you don't have to use all your time. You've got 5 minutes per person. However you want to expound on one goal, multiple goals, it's totally up to you. Or you can keep it at 30 seconds and move.
It would be investing in a way that operationally and from a capital standpoint, we've got more buses on the road. We're getting people to use the bus. It helps to justify moving to electric buses as well, but we need to understand that those are both huge ticket items, and so how can we incorporate both those visions to create a more efficient bus system that connects people and gets people where they need to go on a timely basis, and also redefines what we consider to be affordable housing because of it.
Who's next? And I love this. How might we around transportation?
I'm going to be very focused this year on the 2040 plan because I think it's completely transformational. It's going to redefine basically how we do all of our zoning. It will have a big economic impact, and it will set a course in terms of what the city is going to look like in the future. So we need to be sure to get it right. And my concerns there are that we balance properly commercial interests with the aspiration that we have for the city, quality of life aspirations. We have big congestion problems that I hope we're going to tackle in the course of the 2040 plan. So there are many dimensions to it, but as I say, it's a one-time effort, it's huge, and we need to get it right.
And just so you know, this idea of quick going around the horn, and then when we get into categorizing our goals, that's when we'll have more time for debate, discussion, questions, what have you. Again, I'll ask you, if you have questions about a specific thing, capture those on your Post-it notes so we can get them all.
Thank you. My big ticket item or above the line is still going to be the affordable housing and strategic development. And what that means for me is to keep the residents in mind. So as we're going big, not to keep the residents, the strategic development as far as the infrastructure, and also inclusivity. When we're building, we need to consider those who are disabled and mentally ill and homeless. So just to keep the residents of Charlotte forefront in our planning.
There's a principle in the innovation world called thinking left-handed. It's a shorthand for thinking about people who are not like us. And there are more than people like us across lots of dimensions. Matt.
Thank you and good morning. Should I stand up or are we sitting down now? Does it matter? Okay, even better. Building on what Ed said a moment ago with the 2040 plan, which is my understanding we'll have done this year, right, Ty? September time, right? We'll begin something back, but also the UDO to make sure that we can streamline our rezoning process, make it a little bit easier on us as council members, identifying funding for our transit projects, maybe having a plan in place for how we're going to afford those, potentially identifying new forms of transit. You know, we were looking at our greenway system with the Cross Charlotte Trail. Maybe we can expand upon that. Infrastructure, there are plenty of lights out across the city. I think maybe that there are ways that we can utilize our departments better to identify where those are out, maybe even identify areas where litter exists. And employ our departments to make sure that we clean that up. And then also link our city contracts to local employment. We might be talking about that here today or tomorrow with Project Peace and some of the other city contracts and projects that we have in the pipeline. But just wanted to make sure that we're taking care of our folks here in back in Charlotte. And then finally, I have to say it, Eastland. Yes, let's get that done.
Good morning. As we are growing at such a fast pace, we are seeing growth and development throughout the city. What I'm concerned about that if we are not intentional about the development, we'll lose our natural resources, especially our tree canopy. So how do we grow as a city where we are continuing to protect and preserve our tree canopy? So we got to look at a tree ordinance and overall urban master plan for our trees. So that's one. Second, also delivering on our promises with 2030 and 2050 goals for the CAP that we had set last year, or actually in 2018. And circular economy, implementing that, and actually seeing the results of the investments that we had made.
Use your time, you can yield, so I got like 35 minutes based on you guys not using your full 5 minutes, so I'll only take 20 of it. I would like to just focus on two words again, intentional and taking the big shots. When we talk about neighborhoods, corridors, and communities, and that we're intentional about what we do and we focus on the people that live there. That we focus on economic development and do the big stuff. We got to do that. It fuels our economy. But we also drill down and talk about economic development with a small e in terms of incentivizing small businesses, not through our procurement program by 10, 20%, by actually pitting people in business and on corridors, in communities, and doing those type of investment to our own companies locally. That we connect people through transportation and that we think big. And I talked to the mayor about what does it cost to build a whole system out? I don't know what that number looks like. I don't know what if that's something we can do, but let's kind of put that on a piece of paper and see what it looks like. And how do we connect through our transportation, our planning, and our zoning, how those things are talking to one another. And then I guess the last 4 big items would be, one, we talk a lot about public safety, but I would like to have a great conversation about emergency management. We got 17 new events in 2021 with 30,000 more people. We're building outside of the center city with mid-rise complexes. I mean, the RNC is coming in August, so are we funding our emergency management plan has been updated? Are we funding police and fire and medic and all those at a reasonable level that kind of talks about our growth and being prepared? We have to be prepared every time there's a major event. The bad guys only have to be right once. And short of consolidating government, really talking about how we work with Mecklenburg County, because every time we talk about something, Councilman Johnson mentioned it, they're county function as well, and so, I mean, should we have that big conversation that we started back in 1990 about consolidation? Not advocating it, but I'm just saying that we have to be intentional about how we work together. And lastly, I think I've already said it about economic development on this, with a small e, focusing on small business.
So for ones that haven't been said yet, I think particularly given my role chairing the Safe Communities Committee, while I know we have not taken our eye off of community safety at any point in the last 2 years or any amount of time, I think that for all of the wins we've had in the last term, I think a lot of people will see the crime in our city, particularly the murder number that we had last year, and that's probably the top of mind thing for a lot of our constituents. So I think we've got to not just prioritize fixing the murder number and the murder rate, but I think violent crime and crime as a whole, because I think if we don't make progress on that and people don't see a focus on that, then all of the other wins we could possibly achieve will be not appreciated or not important. And then 2, I think for me, and particularly given the district I represent, by the end of this term, I would hope that both for phase 3 of the Gold Line and for the Silver Line, Link Silver Line, that we would have gotten to a place where we are either fully committed or not to executing both of those, and also have a plan in place for how we would fund them. I think we need to be locked in on those sooner than later if we're actually committed to doing them.
So I have 2 that are not project specific, but I think that we need to actually have a thoughtful conversation about how do we empower residents in our city to impact the work that we do. And I say that because I believe that people want to participate more, and we've not figured out quite how to do it. I know Ty's group is working a lot on that, but one of the things that from Saturday that I remember the woman saying is that sometimes the majority is just the people that speak the loudest, and how do you get the people that are not speaking to participate? And so empowering people in this, and I think that this is knitting together. What we used to do is kind of infrastructure by district or neighborhood or whatever, but we've got to create living by district or neighborhood. So when we talk about infrastructure, it's got to include the idea of how do we make commercial centers vibrant for the people that live there? How do we make it possible for people to live where they work? And that's just philosophically one. The other things that I think we have to be prepared to do 2 things. Sometimes to say no, and to be flexible even when we have a plan to change it. And I know that's tough because we often have these great plans and people come in and they say, well, we want to do this, but if we have to set priorities, we have to learn to say, That's not on the list today for a number of things that we're doing so that we can focus our work and get some of these big things accomplished. So what are the things that I think are really important? I think we need to look at shifting our housing from rental to single-family ownership. I know a lot of you have met with some of the folks out in Ballantyne, but 27% of their houses are under $250,000, and under $250,000 is an 80% purchase. So what's keeping people from that ability to do that? So we did 1,000 rentals underway. We'll have another probably big batch coming up with a second. So should we start thinking about the West Charlotte Land Trust and making sure that they're successful? Should we start thinking about where we want to preserve housing so that gentrification doesn't happen? So that, I think the single family part of neighborhood is important. And the final thing I think is funding the transportation. Whatever we decide, we're going to have to ask this community for a big step to actually make transportation work. If we start talking about congestion in roads, we talk about buses, and we talk about trains, we have to have something that gets the community a foundation for that financial decision. So those are my three.
One, two, who else? 1, 2, 3.
Good morning. Happy Monday. I would like us to put a real focus on systems change and not just looking at points of the system, not just programs. How do we create changes that will be perpetually active even 10 years from now or 20 years from now when none of us are here? I want us to develop an equity lens that we apply to all of our decisions, regardless if they are economic development or housing or transit. We need to make sure that, or something like a scooter ordinance, we need to make sure that the decisions that we are making are equitable for all Charlotteans, and we're not furthering the divide within our city. Lastly, I would like for us as a council to adopt practices where council members are spending more time together with each other and other policymakers and elected officials to collaborate on comprehensive policy solutions for all our constituents, sort of like what Councilmember Graham was talking about, but I don't think it just limits to the county. We can't make policy and in silos the way we've been doing this. There are a number of state agencies, there are a number of federal assets that if we work together, we can really catalyze the type of work and the solutions that we're seeking.
Okay, I think we're down to 2.
So most of the things that you all mentioned is exactly what's on my list, and many of these I've already shared with several of you in the room, but I'll just run down it very briefly. Essentially, I've got 4 key focus areas that are the same: community-driven strategic planning, affordable housing, economic mobility, and transportation. So I'd like to explore, when we talk about home ownership, when we talk about affordability, how do we extend the Aging in Place type program to location focused. Obviously, streamlining zoning and permitting is on my list. When I think about investing in corridors and really driving that community leadership like the mayor was just discussing, that's one of the areas that I really want to bring focus to and help support, is how do we help the residents who live there determine specifically where they'd like to go in that area. And to that end, when we talk about corridor revitalization from an economic development standpoint, how do we get very, very specific about not just where the large projects are going, but how do we build and create those centers within the corridors? And getting very specific on what are the parcels, who are community partners that we can work with, property owners, how do we go about really driving the changes in the areas as the community sees fit. I'd like to increase the representation of District 3 specifically on city boards and commissions. So some of you, I'm sure, have seen a couple of the emails I've sent out in that regard. I think that goes back to that community-led planning piece. The mayor already mentioned the West Side Community Land Trust and getting proactive about acquiring properties and and converting our assets to allow homeowners to increase versus just rentals. Project Peace was already mentioned. How do we connect workforce development to contracts and apply some value add to that, the same way we've done with MWSBEs? When you talk about MWSBE growth, how do we build capacity there? How do we benchmark from other cities? We've talked about this, of course, Atlanta, and also I think it was Milwaukee that we discussed. How do we go about partnering to increase our opportunity for leverage there? Really interested in looking at other tools for raising funds locally as you talk about transportation investments for some of the lower hanging fruit things. So I know some of you, we've already discussed MSDs in areas and what does that revenue actually look like and what can we do with it as we await the 90-day action plan in regards to short-term, mid-term, long-term improvements. What's on there that's within the order of magnitude that we could fund through an MSD? I really need support in Still Creek. So as we talk about transportation, and even as the mayor talked about being able to say no and prioritize, really, really need support holding the line and getting real clear about what's impactful to us now. We're in a very different situation than we were, where we had a lot more land and we could build and build and build. We looked at certain metrics that helped us make decisions, and I think that it's worth the conversation now to really understand, has our situation changed? Are we at capacity in certain areas? And if so, how do we assess that in a way that's impactful for the residents that live there? And how does that show up in our ordinances so that we can be very specific about what we're trying to cultivate, where we're trying to cultivate it? So I know Ty and I have had some conversation already in regards to the UDO and how we really govern that and what our inputs into our planning and zoning decisions. We've already talked about investing in bus transit, parking rides, bus rapid transit. As far as the airport, we've talked about some ways that we can help airport shift workers get to and from the airport, especially in off-peak hours. And then finally, successful implementation of TOD. And what does that really look like along our current and future transit corridors? How do we monitor and make sure that we understand and that we're leveraging all of the tools in the TOD box so that as we're approving zoning petitions, we can make sure that we've been thoughtful about how that impacts the community in the future. So, and sorry, one more. Oh, well, I mentioned it as far as data.
Yes.
I did think about it, just forgot. We are in the lowest unemployment in our community in a large way, and I'd like to see us move things like Project Peace to a strategic workforce plan where people that have been in jobs that we can get to $15 to $20 to $25 an hour, and to focus on that while we can when the jobs are really the cooperation of the private sector. And instead of us looking at how do we fund some of those things, what I think that TARC is really, and this is before he begins, aren't you the last person? Before you do this, is that the model that the FinTech Hub has been doing has been, where do we plug in for the people that need the work, that we can find well-paying jobs and not just have it be a training program. So I think that that's that flexibility piece that I wanted to just note. So with that.
Thank you. Good morning. Morning, Larkin. You look good today. Public safety is the top item for me. Going down this path that we're already on, especially with the data and the analytics, artificial intelligence opportunities there. I think we are on the right path there, and we need to see that one through. Also within that, though, is the work of the intergovernmental stuff as it relates to, we've done a lot of great work, and there are other parts of this system that are broken that we don't control. So it's going to be really important for us to get out there and partner with a lot of different folks. And my co-chair and I have already started working on that and picking up where we had left off. Second is infrastructure.
just keeping up with growth, particularly in my district, but across the entire city. We're growing faster than we're kind of putting in that critical infrastructure around it, and people are really feeling the pain. So that's critical. Also within infrastructure, the CNIP process, where we've started there, but also kind of redefining and learning from the lessons we've had, kind of creating, instead of a list of projects, rather a playbook, or things that we can call things that are living, that aren't something that collects dust over time, that all parts of our city can use in a new model. I think we've done some good work there. And then roads, particularly Providence, but I mean, we talk about it all the time. Got another rezoning coming up, another one that is going to be the same thing about Providence and the traffic. It's Groundhog Day with that, and it's so impossible to talk about corridors like Providence during a rezoning and what needs to be fixed. So if we don't get ahead of this, I mean, I don't know where it ends, but that's something we've got to get our hands around, and partnering with the state is the only way to get that done. And then third, and I'm just throwing this in because it kind of fits in with roads and Providence, the future of transportation. I'd really like to spend more time thinking about, as soon as 10 years out or less, we're seeing where autonomous vehicles and even, flying taxis in Raleigh, I mean, stuff like that. Like, we really need to go deep into the R&D elements of what is being rolled out that is going to change the way we think about the major bets we make in transit and transportation. And I don't know that anyone's going to be able to know the right answer to that, but it's something that I think we should spend a quality amount of time working with companies like Cruise Autonomous Vehicles in California and others like that, who literally right now are piloting the things we're going to be using in a couple years. And then a couple years after that, cars are going to be coming off of the assembly line without steering wheels. And I think we need to prepare ourselves in the bets we make as a city on the most likely scenario. Economic development is number 4. I think we've made a great amount of progress. We have the right team in place, everything like that. I want to stay really focused and perfect how we go after technology companies, particularly smaller and medium-sized, high-growth technology companies, recruiting them, bringing those jobs here, diversifying our own economy, and then particularly also looking internally in the city to the small businesses that are already in our own backyard, the ones that we know generate thousands of more jobs than the big ones combined, that we honestly, and we have admitted, pay little attention to. I think really putting that small business kind of lens and resource center around our thoughts there is going to be important to the future of the city. And then that along goes with workforce development. The mayor said it. I think we have an amazing opportunity to overhaul the PEACE program and really make this not a training program that is probably more expensive than it should be and less effective than it could be, and turn it really into workforce development. Like, this is, changing lives, upward mobility. That's the most important thing I think we could do to kind of tie together all the things we've been doing around upward mobility and silos. Amateur sports, I think there's a lot of opportunity around that. The mayor pulled me in, and I see this opportunity with esports that this doesn't take a ton of incentive. This just takes us paying attention to it. And I think that we could have a major economy that drives a lot of revenue into the city. Also golf, amateur golf, and the opportunities around that, but not just bringing that in, but also what it can do to change young people's lives that are in poverty. I know firsthand how important a golf program, a Dana Rader school, but directed towards upward mobility, that kind of thing, could be a really game changer. And then a couple other quick hits. Affordable housing, I'd like to really focus in on the regulatory burden that we have in some of our processes that increase the cost of affordable housing. Love the boards and commissions direction that we're going. I think we could unleash a ton of ideas and knowledge and just untapped potential of really smart people in our city that are already volunteering, and we literally don't get to hear what they say. keep pushing on the horizontal nature of the city organization, really connecting the dots, and not working in these vertical silos that so many large organizations do. And then finally, taking a deeper look at the arts and seeing where do we go from the last approach that failed to where we go forward from here. Because I think we're all going to need to creatively think about what does the new plan look like that our community could get behind.
Sir.
I wanted to add one sort of below the line item, and it was touched on by a couple topics, but with regards to zoning, rezonings and development, I would really, and I've been talking to Taiwo about this, really finding ways to empower neighborhoods to understand the zoning process and understand how to work with developers, because we keep seeing these emails about how do we fight the city, how do we fight developers, instead of saying how do we work better with them, because we've all seen projects where neighborhood leaders are organized and they have a base of information that they know that they can work with developers, and developers will go to them first before they even try to get a rezoning. And they understand that if a neighborhood group is knowledgeable of what's going on, has been working with developers, if they can't get past them, they're not going to get 6 votes. And I think you see that in some neighborhoods, and then you have other neighborhoods who feel so powerless. So we've been talking about things like those development meetings. How do you make it more accessible by having them online, giving people a comment period, because many of them can't show up when it's scheduled at 9 in the morning on a Thursday. So that whole process is something that I think we need to really think about and help our residents feel that they have more ownership in the process.
Thank you. All right, before we move to the next part of this, because that went a little faster, we started a little bit earlier than we thought, then we'll take a break after we get to the first part. Just a couple of quick reactions. So one, as I said, I run an innovation consulting firm. One of the cool things about starting your own gig is you can call yourself whatever you want. So the title I bestowed upon myself is Innovation Provocateur. And if you're not familiar, provocateur is French for knucklehead. But in reality, the reason I bring that up is because part of my role here, obviously keep the trains running on time, but is to, in some ways, provoke you and also help you think a little differently, or maybe a lot differently. So 3 quick reactions to what I just heard. One, and again, it's stuff you already know, but I just want to make it top of mind. One, the world of marketing, there's this phrase that's been around for years, is that people don't want drills, they want holes. So if you're in the marketing space, don't keep promoting your drill, this many bits and this many speeds and all these things. It's focus on what people want. And if you think about it, they don't really want holes. What they really want is to hang a picture of their kids or install a new light fixture. And so when you think about infrastructure, transportation, you are the group that has to think about that. But for the people you're serving, they don't want transportation. They don't want light rail. What they want is to be able to get back and forth to wherever they're trying to go. So there's that. Now, you have to think about transportation. I mean, otherwise, who's going to do it? That is your job. But then how you frame those things beyond, we got to do transportation better, because we do. The second thing is around this notion of force multiplication. So I spent 10 years combined in the Air Force and the Air Force Reserve. My father was a career Special Forces guy in the Army. And, it's easy to think about those guys as the Rambo movies. But one of the things I've learned from him is, again, most of his time was in Vietnam, was this notion of what they primarily did was not the Rambo stuff, but was what they called force multiplication. Yeah, a highly trained 12-man team can do lots of stuff, but when they can get the locals, and they can empower the locals to do stuff, 100 highly motivated people, because it's their neighborhood, can do a lot more than the 12 can. So what ways in this notion of enabling our neighbors is how might we enable them to be force multipliers? And then lastly, Renee, to come back to something you said around inclusion. So almost every organization, every municipality, there's some focus on inclusion. And I don't mean to sound like derisively, but for some organizations, it's almost a check the box thing. Are we inclusive yet? Good, great, let's go back to what we're doing. And I know that's not what you're about. But something that I've come across recently, let's reframe my own thinking around inclusion, and this actually comes from the Microsoft folks. I know you guys have the Digital Alliance with them. The Microsoft Inclusive Design Team is helping their organization. There's three key principles of inclusive design, and the first is recognize exclusion. And it's the question of, it's something that we've now incorporated in all of our work, is who are we unintentionally excluding? Just because we didn't think about it. We didn't think about the left-handed people, or the short people, or the people who live way over there and need to get over there. So if you're thinking about inclusion, start with this: who are we unintentionally excluding? And see where that may also get you, in addition to the other ways you think about this sort of stuff. All right, that's all I got. Yes, ma'am. And so, yep, the mic business.
Can you hear me? Can you talk a little bit about how to find the people you're excluding? Because oftentimes you're excluding them because you don't see them.
Absolutely. In the first part, so this is the maybe not so helpful, simple answer, but it actually goes back to something Malcolm said, is simply start off realizing there are probably people we may be unintentionally excluding. And just by being intentional thinking about that, it becomes, oh, right. We don't have any left-handed people in this session. Now, how do we find them? And the answer to that is a longer discussion. But the first part, often it's really simple, like, oh, yeah, who knows some left-handed people? Great, get them in. But it's just recognizing who's not in the room first is a great first step. Otherwise, other than just saying, we need to be more inclusive. Of course we do, but how do we do that? There are the other two principles there is learn from diversity, so actively seek out, right, the left-handed folks. And then the last one is to solve for one and then extend to many. Don't try to solve for all. Solve for one and then figure out, well, that actually applies here and here and here. Incorporates these folks and those folks and those folks. I hope that's helpful. We'll build, yeah, again, we can talk more detailed later. So with that said, let's move to the next segment of this, is where we need to come to a shared understanding about the output we're about to put on the board. So you shared your goals, right, with your colleagues. Now what we want to do is to capture those, right, Post-its and Sharpies. But two things. One, we're going to bucket them into 3 time horizon buckets. Initially, we walked in saying it's going to be short term, medium term, long term. And we'd have to calibrate on how are we going to define those, because it's really critical that we're all defining short term the same way. However, in a conversation with the mayor last night, she suggested a slightly different labeling, if you will. And Mayor, correct me if I get this wrong. One was short term being 120 days or less. 120 days or less. And instead of medium term, it was things that need to go into the budget cycle. Is that right? So that would be a second category that has a notional time frame around it that you guys are all familiar with. And the third would be long term. And I think we said 2 years or more. Did I get that right? So that's a proposal for how we bucket our time horizons. Reactions. And this is where the mics are our friends. So Larkin and then Braxton.
I guess just as an example.
Got to more into it, yeah, sorry.
One of the ones I mentioned, I guess would be hard to fit neatly into one of those boxes, because if you're talking about strategies for crime reduction, and that's something that we would want to do imminently, but then also it's a long-term strategy. It's work that's never done.
Yep.
A lot of these are kind of work that's never done, affordable housing or
absolutely. Great point. So what that also might mean, again, why Post-its are our friends here, you may have some things that show up in multiple places, not which one, but, and then it may be very specific. So, as it relates to crime reduction, is there some specific thing we want to tackle in the next 120 days or less? Great, but it needs to be more specific. So the second part of this is, once we calibrate on those time horizons, is to have an agreement on what's the format, if you will, of what we're putting. So for example, my proposal, what I would suggest is that you make it actionable. It needs to be a little more specific than just say, for example, affordable housing. That's not really a goal, that's a topic, right? And so crime reduction, if there are some specific things, then great, this is the thing we should tackle, and here's the other thing, and then here's the bigger thing. So how we articulate those will go a long way toward how we're able to structure and then prioritize those things. So another reaction to this time horizon.
I was a big fan of 2 years ago when we were sitting in this room. The mayor introduced kind of two ways of thinking this kind of quadrant.
Yep.
Short term, high impact, low impact, easy, hard, as well as the 30, 60, 90 day approach.
Yep.
And I think we should really try to focus our work in that 30, 60, 90 day approach. And then we should be structuring the way we meet, the way we talk, and the way we handle our business around those 30, 60, 90 day periods. Because while our impact of what we do, we want it to run much longer than that.
Right.
The effectiveness of our terms, of our work, they really, 90 days is as far out as we can. So
right.
In those 30, 60, 90 days, we should have structures where we are looking at those points on the quadrant, readjusting, recalibrating. For instance, there's some things that, for instance, look hard, but as we're doing the work in those 30, 60, 90 day periods, we might say, oh, this was actually a lot easier. For instance, these joint county city CMS meetings or review of public lands. They look hard here, but if over 30 days we are structuring our work in the right way, where we're all going to different county commissioners or going to different school board members, we might see that this is actually a lot easier, and this is something that we can move to, to a different part of the quadrant,
right.
And we can hit something 60 days from now, as long as we hit these goals, as long as we touch base within this time period.
Yep.
And while that method kind of guided us on our first year, sort of, we never built around that.
Sure.
And I think if we build around those time periods, we can create processes that sort of automate themselves because we're all falling in line.
Sure.
And getting used to it,
So,
creating that culture around those time periods.
So just two quick reactions. One is that for tomorrow afternoon's discussion around transit and transit-oriented development and such, we are going to go back to those three.
But we think we should do it with everything.
Right. So I get that. So I know that's already planned. The other thing, there may be an opportunity, whether it's here or beyond today, of within whatever you put in that short-term bucket, that you go back and then even more put a fine-tooth comb to it, decide 30, 60, 90.
So thank you for reminding me of that, because last night when we were talking, and now we have some content and context, I do think that the idea of having things within their short term and difficult or easy, and then there's longer term that's difficult or easier. So I think it is a good idea to go at high or low in the days. I think that would be a better. So it's a grid that we used last time, if I remember.
Yeah, think of it as 3 grids.
Oh,
right?
yeah, here it is.
Short-term, a grid
You know, I
medium
should
term,
remind
and
myself
long-term.
of this. So can we do that for short-term and long-term, and do the grid? Or
We
you're
absolutely can. Here's the only other thing we had planned to do. So again, there's planned, and then there's what makes sense for
Okay.
us to do. The other part that we had planned, so this notion of this morning was to just what are the goals and put them in those 3 time horizons. Then this afternoon, bucket those across 5 different, or we walked in with the 5 categories, but we were going to let the categories emerge, and they were things like housing, sustainability, good paying jobs, community safety, transportation, and planning.
Would it be helpful for the individuals to do it as we would do it, and then find out where we change this afternoon?
Absolutely.
I think that's a good idea.
But initially, it's just what are those goals, then we figure out where they fit both within a time horizon, and then if you want to further map those to, right, impact versus cost, or impact versus, what have you.
So
you can certainly do
label
that.
what you want us to do, and then we can probably
Okay.
figure out how to move it
Yep.
forward.
Well, the first thing, though, is we have to agree on the labels. And so, again, the initial proposal was short, medium, long-term, define those, calibrate on those, but then is it better to say short-term, impacted by budget cycle, long-term? That's what we have to agree on. Regardless of timeline?
Yeah, because, the timeline, what is, no,
Stephanie,
I agree with the mayor, because even if something is long-term, that doesn't mean we're not going to immediately start working on it. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So, and something that is short-term, we might be able to do something really quick, but
Yep.
need to kind of keep looking at it long-term. So, like, I agree.
So if we categorize, so it's basically deciding what's the first dimension to categorize on, right? Do one, and then you can layer on the others. So if we don't categorize by time first, that's fine. But then we have to calibrate on what do we mean by low impact, medium impact, high impact, so that we're using those terms the same way. So if that's the proposal, that we do it by impact.
I think it might be okay even if we don't understand quite or agree on what the
kinda
terms
sense what
are.
people think
Let's
they
just
are.
kind of see what people are thinking, and let's see how it goes, because we can have an opportunity to discuss what that mean.
Absolutely.
And so I know that we all have the same yellow cards, but maybe if you could just put your initial on it, then that would help us sort it better.
Yep.
Because we bring different perspectives and
Absolutely.
different ideas to what's important. So
Yep.
I think let's just put our initials on the things that we would put in those categories.
So does that work? Everybody understand what we're going to do? So this is, Ed?
I still have a concern about, I've seen this too many times, and we put this down, we're going to do this in the long term, blah, blah. I mean, we need to identify certain events or deliverables or observable consequences of things that we do and schedule those, and then we need to backfill the sequence of events that it takes in order to make them happen. So from that would come, for the next year, a scope of activity that includes things that we want to finish in the next year and things that we're going to do certain steps on in the coming year. Yep. But particularly long-term often ends up being whenever.
Someday maybe.
And if we get more specific about, we want to do such and such with the buses. We want to be at a certain place with our buses at a certain time. When, you know, and we want to increase the housing stock by a certain amount based on the resources we have, and set dates on which we're going to be able to see results from these things, and then time sequence them based on those results. And as I say, that will then require that we back into the activity that leads up to that result.
Ed, I agree with you, but I think that's this afternoon. I think that's after we hear additional information, but this is just to kind of get a scan.
Yep.
Get a scan, and then this afternoon we go deeper with where we have more agreement. I don't know if we have agreement yet, so let's just throw it out there and then figure out what we really would like to focus on, and then go into the dive, because it's a lot of stuff
Absolutely.
right now.
Yeah, think of this as a tiered approach or a layered approach. We're first going to just, what are the goals, right? You said a bunch of stuff, now let's get it captured so we can see it, and then start to organize it, categorize it, because eventually if you don't get to this, right, the SMART goals and what are we actually going to do, none of this matters. But we're not going to start with what are we going to do, it's what are the big things? And then figure out what are the things, I think you described it earlier, above the line, and then what are the details below the line, and then you can get to make that happen, what's 30, 60, 90, otherwise, again, it doesn't happen. So, one more time, do you want to start with impact? Are you guys comfortable with that? That's your first dimension that you're thinking about? Objections? I always forget how you do this, right? Motions and objections, but, so what I think I see is we're good to start with impact. So here is the deal. We're going to take a short break, but so you decide. Actually, you don't decide. I'll decide. What you need to do is to start capturing, if you're not already doing so, those goals that you want to put up on the board, right? Small impact. What was it? Low, high, medium, and high impact. One goal per Post-it note. Then we'll take a break, and then we're going to come back and start putting those up on the map, and then start to see, all right, what goes where and why. Then start to have those discussions, why I think this is high, why I think this is low. And then again, this afternoon, we'll get even more detailed on whether it's buckets of housing, sustainability, what have you, or time frames. Does that work? All right, so some quiet, independent time take 15 minutes, 10 minutes, put your goals down. We'll take a break. We'll get on the actually mapping it probably 10 after. So how granular should you be at this stage? I would say more granular. I don't know if this is helpful. More granular is better than less. Right? Affordable housing, I'm not sure how useful that is. Increase affordable housing is more useful. If you have something even more specific, great. Increase affordable housing or distributed affordable housing, whatever it is. So we're going to put them, I'm going to put the labels up. I just need to know what labels we were going to use. So you capture, again, individual items per Post-it note, one item per Post-it note. get back to this. All right, friends. If we can retake our seats. I hesitate because as soon as you take your seat, I'm going to ask you the council members to stand up and come to the board. But for everyone else, we're going to restart. All right, so this was the first cut. The second cut is now, this is very much a hands-on, so we very much believe that innovation is a team sport, but it's also a contact sport. In this case, I need all 11 plus 1, so 12 of you. Come up here and let's see what we have and let's see what it means. And if we need to calibrate a little bit more based on what you've got up here, then let's do that. But No, I mean, no, it's everybody all at once. Like, yes, come up here. Let's see what I want you all to see what you have wrought so far. Wrought? What hath council wrought? Am I saying that right? I don't know what the past tense of that is. Or present tense. Wrought? I think it is. I'm going to find a different word. See what you did. Yes. I'm sad to admit I'm today days old to know that reek and wrought are the same verb. What we're looking for out of this is for you guys to see what everyone else has put and where you have either questions or concerns. So that's what we need to sort out. That's what we're going to sort out together. So first, just get a sense, and then we'll have everybody read theirs off and their rationale. So, if your initials are not on here, please add them. What hath Ed wrought? Or as I... maybe more importantly, what is important for you to capture? Like, so we do that on the okay. we're going to do after this is then have each person just kind of read theirs off and their rationale why. So everybody can hear. That becomes a how might we, because it might not be your staff. Yep. So what we want to do now, hey Matt, do we have everybody? And all right, so council, here's what I'm going to invite you to do now, is each one of you just quickly go through, here's what you put up and what was your rationale behind it if it's not self-explanatory. Okay? Yeah, well, yeah, so here's where we can, and I'm looking for input from you guys as well, right? This is your strategy session, not mine. We've got a plan, but what works best for you guys so my thinking right now is to have each person read off with the mic, because that also allows Stephanie to hear what you put up there and your rationale behind it if it's not abundantly clear. Here's what I said, here's why I think it's low impact. And just quickly go through that list. Okay, just so there's a calibration on what you put up here and why.
I was just telling Councilmember Graham, I don't really do this this part well. I like to talk things out and not really put stuff on pat. But I put two things up. Something I've been talking about for 2 years, reimagining council manager form to better and more efficiently receive public input and level set and adjust the work that we are doing. And I put that in medium impact because I think it can go either way. I heard Councilmember Bakari talking about having city staff taking over facilitating pre-zoning community forums, and I think this is kind of part of it. There's a public outreach that needs to be done, and we are really the heads as elected that really need to facilitate that so that we can get the information back to staff and we can make, and staff can make more informed advisements and we can make more informed decisions. That can be kind of low impact to a sort because it can just be making our constituents feel more comfortable that they are part of the process. But it can also be more high impact. One of, I think, the reaction to this data-informed approach to violence, part of the reason why I think people felt like this was just regurgitating the same information that we had over again because there was no action that came out of it. So, I think if we had council members more closely aligned with the process over the 6 months, we've identified 4 districts that with 4 specific problems that those district council members could have worked with staff to do something in those areas so that as this report was coming forward, we could have been able to say, well, this is something potentially that can be implemented right now. Yeah. Well, yeah, we are the form of government that we operate is a council manager form, and for a long time there's been a kind of a hands-off approach from council members. Some people think that we should just meet on Mondays or just meet with committees. I think we should be working more collaboratively, 7 days a week with staff. to level set, because we can't do the things where we tell staff to do something, they come back 6 months later and we say, oh, that's not really what we meant. We have to we should be working hand in hand with them to readjust. And no, I didn't say reimagine it. I didn't say change it. Reimagine how we work within that system. And identify, I put under high impact, identify streets that can be realigned to form grids and that can facilitate more transportation options. I think that's what we need to do in areas like Providence Road, but then if you look around even on East Boulevard in the future, those lines are just not, they're offset. So the future development, as that place becomes more dense and urban, we're gonna have to do real infrastructure work to bring it into the 21st century.
Donata, before I forget again, you mentioned something about housekeeping we all needed to know.
Yes, a couple housekeeping things. Restrooms, if you haven't found them, the men's is right outside of the door, the ladies is to the right. There's water in the back behind this wall, inside of this room, but on this wall. The rotunda, which is to the left all the way, and to the right. There is snacks and drinks and things in that room. So feel free to go down there. There's all of our signs and things in it. Please watch the boards on the floor to kind of watch where you're stepping or taking out what you don't want to be accidents. It was a really small hole right here, so just be careful when you're walking. And trash. Trash can go on these high bar tables with the navy napkins on the top. Okay? And then if you need anything else, you wait for it.
Awesome, thank you, ma'am. Second thing is our goal right now, because our next time thing is that we have a 11:30 presentation. If we get to it earlier, great. Is just quickly is to understand what you put up here and why. Right? We're going to dive deeper into this afternoon. Okay? So.
Okay. I think I've already said all of these, so I will go very quickly, hopefully. Prioritize key input, which is commute time when it comes to zoning. We talked about, in so many ways, what is the actual impact to the community. So in having some discussions with the zoning team and CDOT, really I've learned that the way in which they approach zoning pre-filing doesn't always incorporate the transportation impacts on the front end. So CDOT will tell you, well, we basically make it magic because it's been decided what box we're working within, and I don't know that that's necessarily always the best case. So prioritize the key output, which is commute time, when considering zoning in high congestion areas. And so the specific action would be use traffic metrics earlier in the zoning process, pre-filing, to better guide project parameters on the front end, because I think some of that envisioning happens before we take a look at that. Activate TOD EX. That one, I've got a couple in my district right now that are going for TOD as conventionals, but I think there's opportunity to use that hybrid zoning bucket. And that one doesn't have to be here, that one can be over there. Yes, please. Leverage Stitch Charlotte and similar programs, as Marcus has talked about here recently, to enable community-driven planning as input into the comprehensive 2040 plan. So Stitch. Yeah, Stitch. So Stitch is basically a community engagement effort, and Pam is in here somewhere, but it's a type of, yes, it's formal, exactly right. And so how do we direct that engagement to not just talk about high-level kind of community goals, but come out of that with this is input into the Comp 2040 plan. Exactly. Invest with land trust to acquire property to preserve affordability. We already talked about that. Workforce development, the goal being people are skilled and they're working and they're able to afford a living. Execute the West Corridor Playbook Implementation Guide with a focus on job creation, our fair share based on population growth and projections in those corridors. Investigate MSD in Still Creek as tool to fund low-hanging fruit traffic improvements. Add locational component to aging in place or housing retention program, and with a focus on forecasting potential location needs ahead of development, the wholesale real estate mentality versus trying to go do work after progress has already begun. Investigate park and ride option in Still Creek to support BRT. People can't ride if they have nowhere to leave their cars. Provide option for and grow utilization of the airport workers program that allows them to have transit to commute in off-peak hours. Those are all mine. Does anybody have any questions? Sorry.
I kept it really simple. One, an aggressive land banking program along fragile corridors and communities, which is actually buys land, control the land, and then even if they resell it to a responsible developer. But I think at this point that the main thing is land control along these corridors. So we'd love to see that. To retool our facade grant program so they can be a little bit more specific, right? We do the facade, which is good, but most of the buildings along these corridors really need more extensive type of work, like HVAC, plumbing, electrical, et cetera. So that we can add that to the facade grant program, kind of change the gas in the car, if I can use that analogy, from regular to premium, get it to be a little bit more effective and efficient. I would like to see that happen. And then lastly, to focus on business creation within our small business development program. It's a procurement-based program now. Either you want to buy or sell something to the city. I want the city to be a little bit more assertive and aggressive in terms of business creation, actually putting people in the business. When we buy these land, we work with a small business owner. We work with a community development corporation. We empower people, i.e., if we wait for Harris Tea to come on Batesford Road, we'll be waiting another 4 years. Why can't we put bylaws in business and work in a distressed corridor and set her up for success? Work with our financial institutions in the community. Have her open up a convenience store, high level, fresh food, eggs, bacon, those type of things. Put people in business. How do we transfer a company that I know now that wants to relocate to Batesford Road and open up a sit-down restaurant, but she needs some help? How do we kind of incentivize that type of opportunity for a business owner to move from one side of the town to a distressed corridor that needs that type of service? So how do we incentivize that within our tool chest?
I think mine is pretty self-explanatory. I hope it says review the planning and or the zoning process to include a comprehensive impact study. And what that means for me, one of the things David said is don't let what you know affect the questions you ask. And because I'm so new that I can ask these questions, like, are we looking at petitions cumulatively, like the one we talked about on, I think, December the 16th? We know that there's 50,000 trips that have been increased or accumulated, but yet that petition didn't necessarily trigger a traffic study. So if we can take a look at the development over the last 2-5 years and see how has it impacted areas like University and areas like Providence and areas like Harrisburg, and really see how the schools have increased, and is it time to really take a look at future development and the infrastructure?
Thank you. So high priority, I had the 2040 plan, which I believe is kind of an umbrella for a lot of the other topics we're talking about. The things that we write into this plan will determine how we do zoning. It should incorporate things like traffic metrics that are better than the ones we're using today. Mentioned transportation here. That's obviously key, but it's also at a $6 billion cost, a huge decision that we're making. And we need to think in terms of what else, like what are we displacing by this, and what do our finances look like as we see through the Silver Line plan. I agree that we should invest more in buses as a lower cost way in the near term of improving the effectiveness of our transportation system. And I'm mentioning here sports as well. We've got the pending transactions with Tepper. In my mind, the $110 million is really just kind of a down payment on a larger vision that we have. It allows soccer to move forward, but I expect there will be many other conversations in the future. And and that's going to have an effect in the entertainment district and, of course, in terms of keeping the team. On the medium priorities, I put housing here because we've already made a big investment, and that's actually an ongoing effort as opposed to kind of something that calls for a new initiative. We will continue to work on housing. I also put crime in the medium category, even though it's such a hot topic right now. The truth is that the crime rate in Charlotte among American cities is actually not extraordinary. So we shouldn't take this lightly. We need to be conscious of the human cost. But we're not yet, in the national landscape, we're not yet in a critical position as far as this is concerned. And then I mentioned here the tree canopy as well, which we have plans for going out to 2050, and I'm not sure we're on track to realize those plans as it stands right now.
So Let me think where mine are. Okay, so on high impact, I mentioned the bus system already. I think, and others have said it, a comprehensive look at what we can do by investing in our bus system to truly make Charlotte a more affordable living city. And incorporate into that the idea of electric buses, because we've got to schedule those two things out at the same time. And you got to really look at what are the capital and operational needs of both working on our CEP plan with regards to transportation and just getting a more efficient bus system that people will want to use. So that's one thing, high impact. Second is, like Ed, we are working on crime. I don't think we've ever stopped working on crime, but right now we've got to really talk about how our resources go into the front-end interventions like the different interrupter programs and models that other cities are using, but do it within the city-county framework that is being developed right now and be a good partner in that process. I think that's it for my high-impact ones. With the medium impact, I mentioned before rezoning, empower residents to be more involved in the rezoning process and understand it better. So I think that will be very impactful. To what Victoria said, looking at, and we've brought this up before, help people understand and us as well, what the overall picture looks like in an area when you're looking to approve a rezoning, but give citizens more opportunity to participate in different ways in the rezoning process so that they understand it better. I also agree that we need to really think about how we can take the lead in assessing our arts and cultural assets and how those are funded and see if there's an opportunity for us to really make a difference, because that's an issue that impacts, that's an equity issue. And I don't think we talk about that enough. So consider structure of our council. So Braxton kind of alluded to that, but I really, the mayor has set up this ad hoc committee that's going to take a look at council terms. And I think that's important because all these things we're talking about are not 2-year goals we're going to achieve. And we have to really have a conversation led by the community as to if 2-year terms really make sense. When you're talking about a 4-year term with overlapping council terms, we're much better able to address some of these issues. These council retreats should be progressive in the sense that let's say whatever we do today and decide today, next year it's, hey, where do we stand, right? How are we doing? And there's some progression. Instead, every other year, we're working with a new council, helping them get up to speed. What is the CIP? Helping to explain that. So none of the things that we are doing really have a 1-year or 2-year horizon. So I think we need help from the community to really address that issue. Another medium impact is developing a scorecard or a dashboard. How are we doing tracking our affordable housing? Where are we on the goals that we set out to achieve on that? And then I had low impact I guess it got moved over here to medium impact. So I think that's it for me. Yeah. Anybody else not go yet?
So pretty much all of you covered some of the things that I have added here. So first, in the medium impact, I have circular economy implementation. Last year or the year before, our council have invested multi-million dollars into this concept, but we have yet to see what the result looks like. So this is not really a policy item or anything from our side, but actually see the results. And I know manager will probably provide an update on that to see how our investments have resulted into environment sustainability or creating jobs and opportunities in an area. Capital projects planning and implementation. I know when we had a Cross Charlotte Trail issue that we wanted to see all the capital projects and how they are doing in terms of the funding, and are we staying on track, or if there is anything that is we need to be looking at to start planning, so there is no budget concerns at the last minute. So looking at that to make sure that we are not ending up in a situation again where we have a major shortfall. This CBI, Councilmember Mitchell asked me to include this, all of us on the ED committee. I think this program is continuing, but I just wanted to still include it here so that it's in the radar. In the high impact, I have included multiple items that's already in the radar. For an example, CEP implementation, Councilmember Driggs talked about that briefly. This is not a policy item that we need to address, but how do we make sure that we are continuing to meet our goals, especially 2030 and 2050 goals that we have. Same with tree ordinance and urban master plan. With the TOD, we had talked about tree ordinance, but that was just very small percentage of the overall area. So we need to look at that from the high level perspective and how that truly impacts the quality of life for all our residents, and look at our urban master plan. And then corridor revitalization. This is something Councilmember Mitchell had asked committee members to include this. So east-west corridor, so we are addressing economic mobility issues. And last but not the least, plan out crime reduction strategies. And I know Councilmember Eggleston is already leading on this effort, but really we gotta have some sort of plan to reduce the crime we are seeing. What is that master plan and how does that look like, so that we can take necessary steps to reduce the crime? So.
Councilman Eggleston, it's your turn, sir. Okay. I'll go. I'll do it. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Great. I only did high impact items because that's how I roll. Amateur sports, we already talked about that. Have city staff take over facilitating pre-zoning community forums from developers. This is pretty specific, but this is something that I have seen over the last 2 years is a problem only really for the high drama ones, where the community's activating against something, the petitioner's moving forward with it. This could be a high impact with really a low effort, I think. We've talked about this before. Taiwo, I've talked to him about it as well, where they almost has this kind of, I don't mean this in a negative way, but a fox in the hen house kind of approach, where the community's first hearing about something that they're upset and activated against, and it's the developer themselves and the petitioner and the representative that are having to explain our part, the city part, in the process. It just doesn't work very well. This could be something where, maybe not even for all of them, but for the real high drama ones, could be a big help, because maybe they wouldn't start by saying, city, where are you guys at? And they're angry with us from the starting line. Maybe it's more like a, here's what's been proposed, one side here, one side. It's just, I think it's cleaner, so it's something to think about. None of that, that's garbage. Providence Road strategic plan. If we could like really move on putting together a working group and that strategic plan with ideas like I've talked to Taiwo about, with like density in lieu, like we do with density and height in lieu, or tree save in lieu. How can we allow them to go above where they want to, but also require them to go and impact traffic and congestion? A future of transportation study group, I mentioned that before, but it'd be good for us to put together like an R&D focused group to go look at autonomous vehicles and stuff and really give us a view of what's coming. That small business, really come up with our strategic consolidated approach there, so that we spend less time on our favorites like Honeywell and Lowe's, which we all love, and more time on all those small businesses in our own backyard that are making a huge dent and stuff. Continue the horizontal coordination and restructuring inside the government, particularly instead of having a net new list of stuff, going back to the things that we've already created and connecting them. The whole connection theme of, we've done all this with affordable housing, we've done some stuff with workforce development, transportation. How do we start using all of that and connecting the fabric of it to really impact upward mobility. Continue what we're doing with business recruitment. We've evolved a lot, but really continue evolving that proactive, going out and spearfishing essentially for tech and high growth smaller businesses, because we are our own chamber of commerce. I don't know if everyone realizes that. Charlotte city government is our own chamber of commerce right now. So if we don't do it, it's not going to get done. And then finally, lower taxes, because we haven't tried that yet. Let's give that a go. Thank you.
So mine was, I propose we raise taxes. That's not up there. But we haven't raised them, so. Most everything, I think, has been fairly well covered. Talking to you, wasn't sure exactly where to put, instead of, hello? Instead of putting the ultimate outcomes, that's fine. Instead of putting the ultimate outcomes, I put the plan part on mine, and talking to you, I said the plan in and of itself is maybe not high impact, but I think the ultimate outcome of having a plan and executing the plan will be high impact. The things I talked about earlier, gold line, silver line, the plan there, I mean, we've identified the corridors and started some of the engineering planning and stuff like that, but we've really got to figure out what the funding planning is. We don't have, the model that we've used to build in the past is not the same financial model we'll be able to use now, most likely, and so we've got to figure out what the new strategy around that is. So the shorter term goal, the longer term goal is obviously to have those things built and running and people being able to utilize them, but until then, we've got, or before then, we've got to have a plan. So the plan in and of itself, I put medium impact. Same thing here with the crime strategies, which has been talked about by a couple of people. Sort of like Ed said about housing, it's an ongoing thing. We're creating strategies, we're creating new frameworks or new ways that we tackle these issues, and then they can be somewhat more self-sustaining. So we've got to identify strategies and programs to help reduce violent crime rate. I think some of that will be part of our budget discussions, because a lot of the things that we want to do will require funding. So again, coming up with the funding policy and funding plan there, but also figuring out what we can do that is evidence-based and provable, and figuring out what we want to, other than just the violent crime rate, what are the statistical outcomes we want to have as it relates to crime so that we can better track our success or failure.
All right, so where did I start here? Expand, so this is a medium impact. Actually, I think it's probably not all that heavy a lift, but expand departmental directives, capacity to combat litter in city lighting. I continually hear complaints, not just from my district, but I think across the entire city, pertaining to litter, and I also hear a lot of complaints about streetlights being out. And I think that these are some easy fixes for us, maybe not all-encompassing fixes, but we can actually put a dent in the problem if we direct some of our city staff to, so kind of on a lower level, so for example, like solid waste or maybe even CMPD, if you see a light out, report it. If you see some trash, kind of on the side of the road, maybe pick it up, and we can start to combat those problems, particularly the lighting problem. Because we're relying on people throughout the city, so citizens to make phone calls, and many of them don't know that that's what they're supposed to do. So anyhow, there's that. Identify and set clear expectation for developers. So oftentimes I think, I have a lot of questions pertaining to the effectiveness of our plans and whether or not, and granted we're going to be talking about 2040 comprehensive plan, we're going to be talking about the UDO, and I think those two policy frameworks are going to solve a lot of the problem. But in the meantime, we're receiving a lot of rezoning requests that exceed our own plans, and I think we can do a better job of maybe nailing down what expectations are. And in that regard, I think also address some of the concerns that we've encountered in the community. I think our neighborhoods and the voices within them are very important. And I think we're not, I don't think that we are adequately addressing the concern by placing the burden on the community. I think what we need to do is we need to say, so instead of saying, how can community members better work with developers, I think the question might be, how can developers better work with community members? And I think that all starts with us setting the expectations, so we know, right, that, and the community knows that those expectations won't be exceeded, and that's the baseline. And I think that that's maybe where some of the concern or some of the discontentment arises within communities. Moving right along, let's see. Reassess definition of transit to include, so I think I'd mentioned somewhere, identify funding sources for city transit projects. And I talked about, so in here I have the Silver Line, Gold Line. Don't know if you heard about the Pink Line. Apparently there's been some talk of something connecting the Silver Line over to Eastland Tide. Does that sound familiar? I don't know, maybe 40 years down the road, right? But having said that, at least in the interim, see, this is how we've made a preliminary commitment, $50 million for Silver Line. Maybe what we can do is start to identify additional funding sources or some sort of plan over the coming years to ensure that these projects do get built, so we can fulfill our existing plans to have that we have in the first place. And then of course maybe what we can do is reassess the definition of transit altogether. And I feel like we started to do that. I don't know if we've actually put that in place, but when we funded the Cross Charlotte Trail recently, we looked at it as a transit corridor, and it makes a lot of sense for us, right? It's low cost for us, it's low cost for the citizens that will be using it, it's also eco-friendly. And I feel like what we can do is we can direct more of our attention to the areas of Charlotte that have the most transit need. And as we wait for some of these large-scale transit projects to come online, we can make some smaller-scale investments and create some greenways that will source or meet the needs, preliminarily meet the needs of the communities that have that need the most. And anyway, I think that might start by us really reassessing or reimagining what we consider to be a transit corridor. And then again, too, maybe even go one step further. So if we're talking about being aspirational here during this retreat, maybe go one step further and say, hey, maybe some of these areas can be TOD or TOD districts as well. And we can encourage some of the development in the immediate vicinity of those areas that we're looking to, to do around our transit corridors. I think, so when we talk about crime, I think we can identify at-risk youth and social service networks to help those youth at a very early age. The statistics we saw last week indicated that many folks in the range of, I think, 18 to 35, and I don't know if this was violent crime altogether or if it was just our homicide rate, but 18 to 35, those were the folks that were offending. And I look at that and I wonder, if you're 18 years old and you found yourself in a position where you committed a homicide, you're facing the charges, potentially a conviction on your record, where does that leave you for your future? And so ultimately, I think this is a problem that we have to start to address at a very, at the source at a very early age. We do that by ensuring that social services and the networks are in place to provide a support structure and system for at-risk youth, particularly youth. And so our Opportunity Task Force report identified 2 specific areas that we could look at to encourage and incentivize upward economic mobility. The first one was early childhood education. I think we touched on that a bit last week, but the other one was a strong familial unit. And what that means is support structures at a very early age at home. To make sure that folks have those opportunities, aren't falling through the cracks, and maybe have aspirational goals in their lives. And I think, so I don't know if we could drill down on this, but I think we might find some of those things very lacking with some of our early offenders, or youthful, so young offenders. And if we can target that, then I think, we would be really behooving ourselves and doing ourselves a service to underscore or to combat the crime that we're seeing. Create a framework plan for building better communities to counterbalance lacking infrastructure and combat crime. What I think I've heard even today is, we need to catch up with our lacking infrastructures in the areas that are being developed. Well, maybe what we need to do is we need to get on the front end of this and say, hey, we need to scale back a little bit of some of our development until our infrastructure actually catches up to support it in the first place. And I think, maybe what we can do, so much like kind of a scoring system that we have with our locational policy, or I think Julie was talking about some sort of a system or some way that we can kind of categorize the needs. Dashboard. A dashboard. Exactly. I think when it comes to some of the decisions we make for development, maybe we can have a dashboard there so we know, and so it's not just a one-off, right? So we know how things score in as much as infrastructure, transportation, the immediate vicinity, and our ability up front to support the development rather than us coming up with, find ourselves in a position where we're creating a mess and then trying to figure out how to fix it or clean it up after the fact. What else? Create a program to place, I'm not done. I've got more. Create a program to place ourselves on the front end of affordable housing the affordable housing process to target locality and cut down on costs. So, we do have a locational policy when it comes to our affordable housing framework, but at the same time, I feel like we're not doing enough to make sure that that we are incentivizing developers to follow that. And what we can do is we can get on the front end of projects. We can maybe put out an RFP and say, this is a particular area, maybe purchase a property, right, and offset that cost to a developer to further incentivize them, but get on the front end and say, this is an area where we want to incentivize this particular type of development, put out the RFP, competitive bid process, they come back, we save money on the back end, and then we ensure that our policies are followed altogether on the front end. I had two other things here. Link our city contracts to local workforce through community partners. We might be talking about that with Project Peace, but I think we could do a better job, particularly if we're the ones awarding the contracts, to ensure that that the contractees, the people that are going to be building out our contracts, work with our workforce development partners to employ the people that are being trained in those organizations or in those programs. And then finally, I always have to say it, Eastland. Let's make sure that we get Eastland done. Let's do that this year. And to Ed's point, there might be a little bit more all-inclusive in our discussions regarding that, but it would be very nice to have a final plan and something we can vote on as soon as possible. That's it? I could go on.
So I want to take credit for two things. I have two low-impact ideas up here. The first one being, when we go through the zoning process, the zoning committee, the staff agree to it, it's on our agenda, and by exception, we let those things go through unless one of the council members wants to speak to it. It would just help us, one, and we always talk about it from our frame of reference, which is, it'll save us time. But if you look around that room when we're doing those decisions, the number of people being paid for those zoning decisions to sit there, it is a cost of development. And we always talk about the cost of what we impose upon people. I think this would help. And it doesn't mean, that it means that you could make the decision to vote for it, but you don't have to. And then I wouldn't have to read that long, extensive statement. The second thing, That's what I'm saying. Basically, a consent agenda, if you want to pull it to have a comment, because the public's not, the hearing's over. But we go through each one of those individually. So it's just one of those things that I say, it's low impact, but it would certainly decrease the cost, I think, for a lot of the people that show up.
What was the question?
Okay, so that's what, we'll figure that out. The other thing the other one that I had is that we've approved Envision Our Ride. So it's about bus rapid transit. It's about allowing the staff to go ahead and move forward with that plan because we've approved it. So I know a number of people said, well, I didn't know we were going to do 4th Street. Well, it's there, it's done, okay. If it's not working, then we can say something about it. But if we don't try it, and it was in the plan, so sort of like letting some of that stuff, the flexibility, the creativity, the plan, following the plan, I like. And then the other thing is just generally, almost everything that I've put up was covered by one of you guys, and so I'm not going to go through it. But I think that what we've got to look at is where does innovation require flexibility? And a number of these things, so sometimes our look is what we currently do today. And I say that particularly around, I hear Project Peace a lot. You remember Project Peace happened as a result of the death of Keith Lamont Scott. But when we've been talking about economic development, we've been talking about workforce involvement and pathways for work for economic opportunity under our plan. So I think, again, like, let's remind ourselves to be current for innovation and to be flexible, to realize that what we've done, what we did in 2016 was in reaction to an event, and that what we're trying to do today is to carry us through the long haul. So that was it.
Good.
Thank you, ma'am.
And I think we got a comment from Braxton over there.
I just added two things to high impact. One, make public transportation free. No, we should make it free. And we need an opportunity zone strategy ASAP, and that's under our high impact. Well, the investment is happening. There's definitely rules that need to be done, but the investment is happening, and there's no one thing that there's no city, there's no municipality, there's no entity that has figured out a best practice for it. We need to figure it out for ourselves.
So just a couple of quick reactions. Again, just making top of mind something you already know, because if you're going to go big, that means you've got big plans, big ideas, big things. So two reactions. One around the innovation front. So we do a lot of work with for-profit, nonprofit, government, academia. And what I've learned in that space, so in the for-profit world, fear of innovation is always about fear of wasting money, right? In the nonprofit world, it's very similar, but it's fear more of, I don't want to be seen as wasting, of being a bad steward of the dollars we've been given or granted or earned or whatever it might be. And what I've learned in government, particularly local government especially, because I think you guys are the ones who really get stuff done, is when you're wrong, you're in the news. You're on the paper, you're on the TV, you're on the radio. And so depending on how that message of being innovative, which means being willing to make mistakes, is how that gets, then that message gets transferred all the way down to all your staff, matters. Because if they're afraid of making a mistake, then they're going to stay way away from that line, way away from it. Now you want to make mistakes cheap and fast, not long and expensive. But if you're not willing to do that, then you're unlikely to be innovative solutions. All right, the last thing we need to do with this before we move to our next scheduled thing, which is our presentation from Mark Vittner from Wells, is I need 4 volunteers, 2 on each side of this, from our council members to come up and take the first pass at clustering these into categories, right? Housing, transportation, what have you. And I think it's safe to say that we don't need to spend a lot of time categorizing the low impact items. We have these 2. Perhaps something could be moved, but what I'm going to ask is 2 council members to take the first stab at low and medium, 2 council members to take the first stab at high. Basically, again, just categorizing these. These kind of go together, these kind of go together. And the last thing before we do that is, I don't know if you noticed this, but what I just noticed is you can't spell Eastland without Ed. It's right there. It's right there. It's right there. So, I've got 1, 2, 3. Can I get one more? And I'm going to bring another board over to give you some space to move these around. Don't worry about trying to make it perfect grouping, just these kind of go together. All right, folks, let's reconvene and talk about what's happening next. All right, so we're going to accelerate things just a little bit since we are ahead of time. We want to stay that way. Just a couple things I want to point out. One, thanks to my co-facilitator, Braxton Winston, we have a parking lot, which I neglected to position. So you've got other items that don't fit into whatever we're working on at the moment. There's a place for them. Two. So it's hard to do any kind of session like this without somebody saying, hey, do we have any kind of toys or something, some sort of manipulatives at the table? So we've got that. However, it's not your normal stuff. You should have multiple packets of these little packets of Model Magic at your tables. Model Magic is just another form of Play-Doh, but it's cleaner, much cleaner. Doesn't leave a residue on your hands or on your tables, what have you. Here's the deal, right? This is a strategic planning. You are planning for the future of Charlotte. So instead of me bringing in some pre-formed toys, make your own. Make your own. Do whatever you want with them. If that just helps keep your hands busy while you're thinking and listening, great. It's totally up to you. But there's resources available at your tables. Lastly, before I invite Mr. Vittner up to talk to us about the economic outlook of Charlotte, just one more top of mind thing for you. Again, stuff you know, but top of mind, especially as I look at some of these big things you are either suggesting, whether they're aspiration or we've got to do them. I'm reminded of something. Show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the books and now podcast Freakonomics? So Freakonomics Radio, Freakonomics Podcast. They had an episode years ago called The Cobra Effect. And they were basically talking about unintended consequences. So some of these big things might be very well awesome, but they might have such negative unintended consequences that you wouldn't want to do them, or you do them and you're like, oh crap, I wish we'd have thought of that. And you certainly can't think of everything in advance, but certainly another question to ask, similar to the who are we unintentionally excluding, it's what else might be a consequence if we do this that we may not want. And it's just a way to help you kind of start to look around corners that it's impossible to fully see around, but it may help you identify things that in hindsight should have been obvious, or people would have said, you should have seen that coming, but you didn't. The Cobra Effect story is colonial India, the British governor of Delhi said, you know what, we've got too many cobras in this city. And so they instituted a bounty, right? It's carrots and sticks, it's incentives. That we will institute a bounty, you bring us cobra skins, we will pay you. And the people are like, yay, right? All the people said, yay. And then some of the people said, ooh, we could farm cobras. Basically, let's raise cobras. They get to a certain size, cut the skin, go get paid. The governor realizes, hey, you people are pretty smart. No more bounty on cobra skins. So then people went, oh, I guess we should let these cobras go. True story. And by an order of magnitude, the problem got much worse than it was had they done nothing initially. So just, there's always something to have in mind. If we do this, this might be awesome, but it might create something else that's way worse than had we not done it. All right. So with that said, Mr. Vintner, you want to join us up front? And Katie, that's our cue. And so we are going to hear from Mark about the economic outlook, then we'll take a break and jump into lunch. And do we have a clicker or anything? Or you got it? Perfect.
I got it. You may have already clicked it. And I'm mic'd up.
You're mic'd up.
I'm mic'd up. I'm ready to go. So, and how long did you have?
I think we got you for 3 hours. Is that right? Yeah.
I just want to make sure I've got plenty of time for questions.
12:15 is when we need to stop.
All right. Well, we will stop before then. So, or right then, or we will be right on time. We'll make it perfect. All right. Well, it's great to see everybody. I wish I'd been able to get here last night, but I needed to be at home at least one night in a week, and so I got it last night and went to go see Come From Away, and the last night it was there, so it was really, really good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the economic outlook in kind of broader terms, and then talk about Charlotte, and things are really good. I mean, I could make the economic outlook really short if I said things are really good, and but there's still a lot of concern as to what's going to happen going forward. A lot of the headlines, and I mentioned this, I was here in Raleigh last week giving a talk on the economic outlook for the Triangle, and I said, if you turn on the news and it's the news has gotten to be the voices have gotten to be kind of shrill on some ends, and I said I have people come up to me and they're worried about recession. I said, the only worry that I have about recession is that it looks to be such a low probability in virtually every economic forecast that begins to raise concern to me, is that when nobody's looking for it, maybe there's something we're missing. But looking at the economy going from bottom up, top down, it looks to me like surprises this year are likely to continue to be to the upside, that the economy is likely to grow faster than expected. Our most recent economic forecast resulted in a significant upward revision to fourth quarter growth, which we'll get in a couple of weeks, but we had been expecting 1.5% growth, now it's 2.6%. That's a pretty big change. And for the year, we had been expecting 1.9%, now it's 2.1%. It's a smaller change. And even with the employment number that came in a little soft on Friday, we added 145,000 jobs. There were some downward revisions to 2 of the prior months. We only need to add 103,000 a month to keep the unemployment rate steady. So if we're adding more than 103,000 a month, the unemployment rate's headed lower. And so there's an awful lot of good economic news. More good economic news that came out since I made the forecast. So it's actually a little dated, but we tend to be conservative in our forecast. The economy grew 3% back in 2018, and we slowed to like 2.3% this past year. About 2/3 of that slowdown was in the manufacturing sector, because the manufacturing sector was most exposed to international trade, and we saw that the volume of international trade declined last year, and it primarily emanated out of the trade war. And it was not necessarily just between China and the United States, but China's economy slowed. It slowed more significantly than the U.S. economy did. China's the #1 market for motor vehicles in the world. They buy 25 million cars a year. We buy 16. And even for a company like GM sells more cars in China than they sell in the United States. But their auto sales have fallen every month since the first tariff announcement was made. And so what happened with that is that weakness fell most heavily on Japan and Germany, which are big auto-producing nations. Their economies weakened. That's why interest rates came down, because German rates came down because their economy weakened. And that's what caused our long-term rates to come down, because pension funds, insurance companies, ordinary investors are looking to get more yield. They bought our treasuries because they were higher than the German treasuries, which were negative. And that's what brought about that short inversion of the yield curve that we saw over the summer. And so it was a very unique situation where there was weakness outside the United States. When you look around at the U.S. economy, other developed nations, the U.S. economy did not slow as much, even though you could say the trade war started with us, although it, even today, after we've added tariffs, according to the World Bank, if the rest of the world would lower their tariffs to U.S. levels, economic growth would be considerably stronger. So if the rest of the world would trade as freely as we do, economic growth would be stronger. And so, I don't know if we'd say we started, but ever since Trump bumped the tariffs, global growth has slowed. The U.S. has not slowed as much as the other G7 nations or the other G6. And then when you expand it to the G20, the U.S. economy has held up better than that, and it's held up better than China. So at least the tariffs came on from a position of strength. In terms of the policy environment, when the economy slowed, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates 3 times. That seems to have been the appropriate thing. When we got into 2019, the expectation was that the Fed was going to raise rates twice. I can't remember what I said when I was back here, but I know that when I was in Hickory in January, we had our interest rate person there, and I told her that, I said, I'm going to tell the audience that I think the Fed's going to cut rates this year, and I know it's counter to what's in our forecast, but it was based a lot off of the slowing in manufacturing. So the cuts by the Fed didn't surprise me at all. I knew that our forecast was a little different than that at the start of the year, though. They're on hold at least through 2020. I don't think they'll raise rates, lower rates. They have Jay Powell said it's a very high bar to raise interest rates. So we'd have to see a substantial increase in inflation. Jay Powell's also said that he believes that even though the unemployment rate's at 3.5%, historically the Federal Reserve has felt that full employment was 4.3% or 4.25% to be precise. He says that as far as he's concerned, he does not believe that the Federal Reserve has met their full employment mandate. And he says the reason why I don't feel that is that wages aren't rising enough, that they're putting enough pressure on inflation that would suggest that we're at full employment. And so we're going to continue to maintain an easier monetary policy. He didn't use that term, but that was the implication, an easier monetary policy until they see some evidence that inflation picks up. On the tax side, I really don't see much change. It's an election year. You'll hear a lot of talk. I don't think there's much change in coming either way. Either if Trump gets reelected or you get a Democrat elected, I don't think there's much change coming. Certainly the election would be in November of 2020. It takes time. If you have a change in parties, it takes time to get any kind of program through. So you're really talking, if there's going to be any kind of change in tax policy, it would be more likely a 2022 kind of time frame, not 2021. So we see the economy see pretty clear sailing through 2021. In terms of trade policy, we're going to get a deal with China signed this week on January 15th. The trade deal is likely to be better than what is widely expected. The press has been nearly uniformly negative on this, so they're saying, oh, they're going to buy some more farm products. They are going to buy some farm products because inflation in China is horrendous right now. And not only is inflation high, but it's hard to get meat. It's hard to get protein in China right now. There are shortages of pork and beef and chicken. And so they're going to buy an awful lot more stuff. I mean, that is, but right now there's shortages and their inflation is relatively high. And, I think Xi Jinping's comment was, are American farmers going to be able to produce enough for them to buy? We have a lot of stuff in inventory, although it's hard to keep pigs in inventory. It's kind of, so pork and chicken, they turn over pretty quick. That's actually something that I think might actually add to inflation in the U.S. later this year or in 2021. We may see that food prices perk up a little bit. In China, one of the things they're dealing with is the African swine flu, which is decimating their pork supply. And really the only way that you can fight the African swine flu is you have to kill all your pigs and you have to burn all your farms. And lots of the farms in China are very small. They're very, even though China's a highly regulated economy, A lot of those farms in the countryside are loosely regulated, so it's going to be very hard to eradicate that issue. And they're the largest pork producer and largest pork consumer in the world. In terms of U.S. households, the data there is pretty good. Now we got low unemployment, income growth has perked up. We've seen that that the strongest gains in income, and I'm going to show you a chart on this in a little bit, are actually coming from folks at the lower end of the income spectrum. At that level, wages and salaries have risen 4.4% over the last year, and when you look at the upper end, they're up 2.4%. Now, part of that's a base effect, but part of that is also that we've seen a lot of pressure. We've seen a lot of a difficulty on the part of employers in finding workers to staff operations. And I'll tell you one other thing, and I'll show you on the graph. About a month from now, a little bit less than a month from now, when we get the January employment data, the first Friday in February, there'll be revisions that go back the last 2 years. And the data from 2019 will show that we added 500,000 fewer jobs than were previously or are currently reported. 2/3 of that downward revision will be in retailing and the leisure and hospitality industry, which is mainly restaurants. In retailing, it's because of store closures, and Amazon and online retailing. In the leisure and hospitality sector, it's because folks are having a tough time finding workers because they're jumping to higher paying jobs, and there is a huge shift away from full service restaurants and even fast food restaurants toward quick service. So kind of the Chipotle model. And in that model, you don't have as many workers. So you're taking labor out of the question. This is particularly true in New York and California, which have passed very aggressive minimum wage laws. And so we've seen that there's been a real push. So if you go to New York City right now, you'll have a real hard time finding a diner. And diners have a different staffing model. You've seen most of those diners have all closed. I already mentioned this already, the recession risk. They've abated considerably. I remember I was taking my son on college tours, and I was in Washington, D.C., and when the stock market was down 800 points, I think it was August 15th, and I had to get back to Charlotte to do an event out of the baseball game. And when you do an economic event at a baseball game, it's the exact opposite of what I'm doing here. You keep your remarks to 3 minutes. 3 minutes. And I said, the one thing about the inverted yield curve, I explained how it had happened 9 times previously. In 7 of those prior instances, we had a recession within 2 years. And the thinking was, hey, we've got an inverted yield curve. We're going to have a recession. It's happened 7 of the last 9 times we had a recession. Nobody ever said within 2 years. And the typical length was about 16 months if you looked at what the average was. But this period of time when the yield curve inverted didn't look like those. It looked more like one of the exceptions. It looked more like the exception in the late 1990s when we had problems in Southeast Asia, which caused a flight to safety, and you had people buying U.S. treasuries because of their safety, and that pushed our long-term interest rates down. In that instance, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates 3 times by a total of 75 basis points. So same playbook that we did now. We didn't have a recession within 2 years. It came 2 years and 9 months later, which would put it in May of 2022. So I'm not saying recession in May of 2022, but you might just want to circle that month just for the heck of it and say, well, that'd be kind of interesting. On the flip side, instead of looking at just historical precedent and what's happened with yield curve inversions, there are few, if any, notable imbalances in the economy. What causes a recession is that things get out of line, that we overdo it. We have too much exuberance in certain parts of our economy. In the last cycle, it was in housing. And usually when things are going well, you don't know. There's usually a story that helps fuel that boom. And that story last time was that, hey, we've democratized credit. We've made credit available for more people. We're increasing home ownership. That's great. It's an ownership society. We've heard all those things. But what happens is my very favorite saying by a non-economist is Warren Buffett. He says, You can't tell who's swimming naked until the tide goes out. And so when everything's going well, you can't see where the problems are. But when the tide went out, we saw there was a whole lot of fraud and a whole lot of homes were in weak hands, and so it became a much more systemic issue. Before that, it was the tech stocks, it was dot-com stocks. And you heard a lot about, hey, it's a new economy. You know, you heard a story like that. Before that, in 1990, it was commercial real estate, which was fueled by the savings and loans, and we had the savings and loan crisis. It's hard to see where those imbalances are today. Doesn't mean that they're not there. There may be somewhere that we're not looking. But in a recession, there's only 20% of the economy that tends to decline. The other 80% of the economy continues to grow. That 20% is home building, commercial construction, investment in plant and equipment, and motor vehicle sales. And if you take them one at a time and you look, we didn't overbuild, we didn't overconsume motor vehicles. Light vehicle sales have averaged about 16.5 million units a year for the last 3 or 4 years. That's replacement demand. We didn't overbuild housing. We actually have a shortage of housing, which is contributing to the affordable housing crisis that we're in. Now, sometimes we can get blinded by all the stuff that's going on around us. I mean, I nearly got lost in South End yesterday. I've been living here for 27 years. I kind of said, we keep following this road. I know we're going to find Tryon Street eventually. You know, you know, it just amazes me how many apartments that we've had. But for all the apartments that we've seen in Charlotte, this expansion has been extremely narrowly focused across the country. You take the top 16 metro areas where you've seen population growth, and we're one of those. Raleigh's one of those. We're the only state other than Florida or Texas that has more than one of those top 16 metro areas in it. Those top 16 metro areas have accounted for 63% of all the apartments built in the United States since the last recession. You add in New York and Los Angeles, which aren't growing from people moving from other states, but are growing from people coming in from other countries, and it's 85%. So 85% of all the apartments built in the United States were built in 18 metropolitan areas. The overall apartment vacancy rate is currently the lowest it's been of this business cycle. Rents are rising significantly faster than inflation, which is a sign that you're not overbuilt. And if you look at the overall vacancy rate for rental housing in the United States, it's the lowest it's been in 35 years. So we didn't overbuild apartments, which is, it looks like an excess. Certainly didn't overbuild single-family housing. When it comes to commercial construction, again, you look around Charlotte and you think, gosh, there seems only a lot of building. Particularly, I work in the Duke Energy Center, so, you know, people are always asking me, what's that? What's that? And, you know, it's like, and there's a whole lot of what's that. And we're not overbuilding commercial real estate. Doesn't mean that some markets don't get overbuilt, but if you add up all the office, industrial, and retail space built in the United States since the last recession, it's only 15% of what is normally built in a business cycle. This business cycle is in its 11th year. Your typical business cycle lasts 6 years. Vacancy rates for office buildings, industrial space, and retail space, even retail space, which hasn't had a lot of demand, are at the lowest levels of the cycle. So that's not an imbalance. We haven't had much growth in capital investment. Well, without those imbalances, it's kind of hard to see how a recession or a serious recession would take hold. The economy doesn't always work that way, but this is the current business cycle. You can see we had one other long one, which was in the 1990s. That was the tech boom. The other real long one we had was in the 60s, which was the Vietnam War, plus putting a man on the moon, different era. 80s was kind of long. Business cycles have been getting longer, and I think the reasons why they've been getting longer is that the economy has become less cyclical. The less cyclical parts of the economy are now larger parts of the economy. This is our forecast going out through 2021. We do have a little bit of slowing right here. The first quarter of 2020 is likely to be a little bit soft because that's where Boeing has been producing the 737 MAX and it's been going into inventory. They're going to shut down production or significantly curtail it That's going to take about a half a percentage point of growth off of GDP in the first quarter. So that's a little bit of an issue. Capital spending has been weak. We see it getting a little bit better. I don't know if it's going to get a whole lot better. There's a lot of structural reasons why capital spending has been so weak. One of them has been the big move to the cloud. And with so many companies moving their IT needs to the cloud, they haven't had to buy as much equipment themselves. They haven't had to hire as much IT staff, and they don't need as much office space. So that's curtailed capital spending all by itself. The other thing that's been kind of more temporary has been with the global economy slowing. A lot of businesses are concerned that with what's going on with the global supply chain, and so they've held off on making major capital commitments until we see how trade's going to settle down. Well, on that score, I can tell you that we're going to get phase one, and you know they're going to get phase one. They're going to work on phase two. Normalizing trade relations with China is something that we're probably going to be hearing about for the next 50 years, because the world has never seen a situation that we're presented with today, which is that we have two large economies, or another large economy that's the size of the United States, operating at the same time. And we haven't seen that. And China is state capitalism, if you want to call that. It's a communist country, but it's state capitalism. China needs a deal more than people in the U.S. realize, because you have competing interest in China. They produce 50% of the world's steel, using some of the most antiquated technology on the planet that pollutes the heck out of the environment, kills thousands of people in China and in Canada and the U.S. each year because of the heavy metals that are in the air. And that's not the way free trade's supposed to work. Those Chinese steel mills borrow from state-owned banks. They never pay back the money. It gets converted to equity, which disappears. And so they have a negative cost of capital. They don't have to clean themselves up. They employ lots of people. A lot of those state-owned industry is owned by the military. Xi Jinping is emperor for life, but his life is in some part dependent upon how well he gets along with the military. So, so that makes trade negotiations pretty tough. But the United States being tough in the trade negotiations makes it easier for him to work with the military. It's a delicate dance all around on those ends. I think the weakness in capital spending is somewhat overstated. This is non-defense capital goods shipments, and it does look weak like the GDP chart does. This is our survey of small businesses, and our survey of small businesses shows the second highest number of small businesses plan to increase capital spending over the next year of any time of this expansion. The National Federation of Independent Business, which is another survey of small businesses, also at the second highest level. So they do their own survey. We have the Gallup organization do the survey for us. So two different sets of small businesses being surveyed. In terms of those downward revisions to jobs, the reason we know that employment is going to be revised to 500,000 jobs lower is there's an employment series called the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. And rather than just a survey of business, a survey of employers, which is what you get the first Friday of each month, it's actually a physical count of W-2s, which is available with a lag, but the latest numbers that we have are through September. And we can see that things have slowed. The interesting thing is that the IRS provides this data because it's tax withholding. So it's very good data on wages and salaries. The Bureau of Economic Analysis gets it, and the Labor Department gets it. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, which we call the BEA, uses it to adjust their income numbers in August. They get the data, they adjust their income numbers. The BLS gets the data at the same time. They don't adjust their employment numbers. They don't release them until February. So there's a little bit of a lag. So even though we added 500,000 fewer jobs, we added significantly more income over the last year from wages and salaries. If you look here, this is wage growth in industries that are at the bottom 40% of the pay spectrum, and you can see how much wage growth has accelerated here. It's getting close to the last cycle's high. And I might say that's kind of interesting because it does, construction, a lot of construction jobs that would be included in there, not, and we're not seeing that. And then this is jobs in the bottom industries paying the bottom 40%. They've also increased but they're up 3.1 as of October. So we've seen a lot more we've seen a lot of improvement at the lower end of the pay spectrum. It's very good news. Unemployment 3.5%. I think I mentioned this before. One of the reasons why the unemployment rate is as low as it is we measure it the exact same way, but technology has changed. By a show of hands, I can see who's listening. How many of you are on LinkedIn? I know more people are on LinkedIn than that. But with LinkedIn, jobs are looking for you before you're looking for a job, which means you have less frictional unemployment. And that's one way that the labor market's more efficient. Another innovation that we have is Uber. I take Uber to work virtually every day. I'm trying to minimize my footprint here a little bit. I know it doesn't totally minimize it, but the guy's going to be driving somewhere anyway. It just makes sense for me because I travel 3 days a week. So paying $240 a month for a parking place isn't worth it if I'm only going to be using it 2 days a week. And it's quicker. And I always get to talk to the Uber people. It lets me, gives me a real-time survey. And something happened a couple of weeks ago, and it just kind of struck me as a fellow drove me home. He just moved here from Silicon Valley. And I said, well, what brought you to Charlotte? He goes, well, I lost my job there. I had some severance. And I was looking around, and Charlotte was highly ranked. And I said, well, have you had much luck looking for a job? He goes, I think so. He goes, I think I've got something. Got a second interview coming up that Thursday. Next day, I'm going to work. I talking to the guy. He just moved here from Los Angeles. I mean, very different. I mean, you don't see a lot of folks coming from the West Coast, but getting 2 in a row. Well, the other thing about that is that in both cases, these are people that moved to town. They're driving Uber to kind of learn their way around the town, and they're looking for a job. It used to be if you were unemployed, you were unemployed. You were looking for a job. Now you can be unemployed, you can be looking for a job, and you still show up as employed. I don't know how much that's influenced the unemployment rate, but that's one of the reasons why we have a 3.5% unemployment rate, and we haven't seen as much wage pressure or as much inflationary pressure as we did previously because we didn't have Uber back then. And it's a way for folks, they are engaged, they're counted as employed. In order to be counted as employed, you only have to work 1 hour for a pay or for profit in the preceding 30 days. Inflation is low and seems to be losing momentum. That's some source of concern for the Fed, although I don't share their real concern there, but they don't want to see the United States go the way of Japan, where we have a deflationary influence take over. We're kind of seeing, they call it the Japification of Europe, where they're seeing some of the same tendencies that have happened in the Japanese economy happen in Europe. A lot of this is demographically driven with the growing older population, and older folks don't tend to buy as much stuff. I mean, if you want to see where the economy's headed, go visit the villages. I just went down there. It's the second time I've been there to visit my in-laws. I only saw one millennial there, and she was a waitress in a place that we went to because the other place was closed, and she looked lost. You know that millennials have killed golf. They've invented taught golf, but they've killed golf as we've known it, and golf courses are going away like they are in Ballantyne. There are more golf courses in the villages than any place on the planet, as far as I can tell. But I do think that the demographics are one of the reasons why inflation is lower. Older folks don't buy as much money, so the boomers are retiring en masse. They got more time to spend, but they don't spend a whole lot. Younger folks, up until recently, haven't seen a lot of wage growth, and a lot of them are carrying student loan debt. Apartments are pretty costly. They haven't had as much discretionary income. Younger folks tend to spend 100% of everything that they earn since they haven't had enough income to cover student loans and everything else. There hasn't been as much pressure on inflation. I think that's part of it. I'm not going to get through every one of these charts because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk, to take questions. This is the global economic performance that I mentioned earlier. The United States is in the blue, G8, G20 countries here. The smaller economies have always been growing faster, but you can see how much they've decelerated. And this is the G10 to the G2 to the G7. And so that slowdown in those other large developed economies is what led the influx of investment into our bond market and brought bond yields down. I'm going to skip over a couple of these others. I'd mentioned that 80% of the economy continues to grow in a recession. That's the blue. In the Great Recession, it came down to close to zero. The black are the four cyclical areas, which is home building, commercial construction, consumer spending on cars, and capital spending. And we have seen a little bit of a slowdown in the cyclical part of the economy. Most of that has been in the energy sector. It actually hasn't been in manufacturing. For all the troubles that manufacturers had and the ISM index has dropped under 50, there are 464,000 job openings in manufacturing today, which is the highest number of job openings that we've seen in manufacturing since we started tracking job openings in manufacturing in January of 1990. So there's an awful lot of, and if you go to Hickory and you talk to employers in Hickory, the ones that are very proactive are going to PTA meetings and trying to convince people that there is a future for their kids if they want to work in manufacturing, and talking about the new jobs that are being created there. This is commercial construction in this business cycle compared to all the previous business cycles. And you can see how much less we've built in this cycle compared to prior cycles, even though you have a hard time convincing anybody in Charlotte of that. Now, I wish I had a comparable number to that for Charlotte, but it's not available. This is the apartment vacancy rate. A few years ago, we were thinking that apartments might be an issue because the vacancy rate was climbing. A little over a year ago, Freddie Mac does a survey of apartment renters, and they ask them, what are you going to do when your lease is up? And the prior year, about 2/3 said they were going to move. Some of those were going to buy a house. In 2018, that survey flipped, and 2/3 said they were going to renew their lease. And we saw the strongest quarter of absorption that we've ever seen. And so even though the reason why they were renewing is there weren't as many options as you would think. And so a lot of people were staying in place. Demand for apartments has been very strong. There is a shift. There's been a shift toward rental housing and a shift toward apartment living and urban living by consumers, and by young people in particular. And I believe that it reflects a structural change, a technical change. And if you think back to economics, there's something called the work-leisure trade-off. And in order to work, you have to pay me enough to give up leisure. What has happened with the evolution of smartphones and really just digital technologies, so you could even throw Netflix and Amazon Prime in there, is that the cost of leisure has gone down, which means the reservation wage, which you need to pay me in order for me to work, is higher. Well, work is, the wage is not just how much you're paying, it's how much you net. And if you're having to sit in the car for an hour to go to work and an hour to go back, there's a cost to that. You're giving up leisure time. People don't want to do that, so they're all moving back to the cities, and they're choosing to rent for longer periods of time. Now, there's another thing, and I mentioned this before, and it's the one that's kind of amusing in some ways, but it's a real shift, is that we're seeing that a growing proportion of women a growing proportion of college degrees are being earned by women, and it's very evident in Charlotte, which attracts lots of college graduates. And so there's a mismatch where we have many more college-educated women in Charlotte than we do college-educated men. And because of that, we're seeing, and we saw that in the employment numbers, at the first time that we've seen in the post-World War II era, where the economy has been growing, more women are working than men. Now, this happened in the recession because when manufacturing and construction, which employ a lot of men, go down, it's not uncommon for women to rise into the majority. But this is the first time that we've seen it at a time where the economy is growing and construction and manufacturing are doing relatively well. And both looking to hire more women, too. I mean, it's I think almost all the growth in construction employment since the last recession has actually been in women. But that's another factor that has lengthened the apartment boom, and that with people getting married later in life, they're renting for longer periods of time. So I think both of those are longer running trends. In terms of the housing forecast going forward, people are thinking that, when I was riding back yesterday through South End, I saw it's there's a sign up somewhere near a development that said, it's time to own, South End. I don't know, that doesn't mean to own South End, it's just, hey, it's time to buy something, guys. We do think that things are going to normalize a little bit, but when it comes to single-family starts, I think that we're still going to be fairly soft in the coming decade. I mean, the millennials have a rising number of millennials reaching 40 every year for the next 10 years. There'll be more people reaching 40 than the prior, then it kind of levels off. After that, you would think folks would get married and buy a house. This is our forecast going out through 2030. It's something that I did for the first time back in 2010, where I looked out 10 years. It's not a forecast, I should say, because we don't have a business cycle in that. It's not meant as a forecast for any particular year, but over that time period, I don't think we get back to a normal level of single-family starts. Apartments are pretty much at a normal level. One of the problems is that the model for single-family homes has changed. And it gets back to that change in the work-leisure trade-off. People don't want to live that far out. They don't want to drive to qualify. And the cost of developing real estate everywhere has increased because the time that's needed to get it done is increased. I can't go to any community that tells me that the affordable housing is a problem for them. Wilkesboro. In Wilkesboro, they tell me that affordable housing is a problem. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, affordable housing is a problem because it costs so much more to develop. It takes so much more time to develop property, and time is money. And it's the regulatory burdens have increased. And some of that is environmental. Some of that is very activist organizations that have slowed down development. The Nextdoor app is cited by a lot of folks. So they're saying that it's very easy for someone to download the most activist policies from the most active. So you can take Berkeley's tactics and bring it right home to Harrisburg. And that has greatly increased the cost of building homes just about everywhere. The other thing that has changed is that with online, one of the things that allowed more affordable suburban development in the suburbs was that a lot of outlying areas would embrace residential development because they knew commercial construction would follow it. But with more and more people wanting to live in the city, forget about that one. With Amazon, we don't need as much retail space. We don't need as much Walmart. We don't need as many Walmarts. We don't need as many Targets. We don't need as many Home Depots. You don't get as much housing. And with more people wanting to live in the city, employers are moving back to the city because they want to hire that young talent. And the values of urban office space have gone way up. The values of suburban office space, next to owning retail, it's been your worst investment since the last recession. So suburban office hasn't been very good anywhere. So you're not getting as much commercial development in the outlying areas, and so single-family housing has to pay much more of the upfront cost of new residential development, and that's added to the high cost of residential development. Now, along those lines, I'd mentioned how so much growth was concentrated in just a handful of cities. In virtually all of those cities, housing has become much less affordable. The problem is most acute out west. That's where economic growth has been the strongest and for the longest period of time. And we saw this when San Francisco and Seattle really took off, because you got Microsoft and Amazon in Seattle. You got more than that there too, but those two in particular. And you got all these other tech companies in San Francisco. And so very quickly, folks are getting priced out of those markets. And so one of the markets that folks moved to was Denver. And Denver was real hot from 2010 to 2015, one of the fastest metro areas in the country. But everybody was complaining very quickly. They said, well, wait a minute, because the houses were cheap for people moving from San Francisco and Seattle, but they became very expensive for anybody who lived in Denver. So people in Denver started leaving, and so their population numbers began to come out because folks were coming from other places, but people from Denver were saying, I got to move somewhere that's less expensive. I moved to Salt Lake City. When Salt Lake City got real expensive, they went to Boise, and they went to, and so it is all throughout the West, all of those markets have gotten very expensive, and now they're increasingly looking for lower cost alternatives. And you see that Charlotte has become one of those. In Charlotte, our home prices are 1.8 times the average income in Charlotte. We're suffering that same malady that Denver is. Our houses are a lot more affordable for people that are moving to Charlotte than people that live here, and they're becoming less affordable for people who live here. But because they're more affordable, we're seeing folks move here from other parts of the country. This is the top 50 metro areas is what I have represented by all these bars here. The areas that are in blue have home prices that are 2 to 3 times average income in that community. The red is 3 to 4, the green is 4 to 5, and we don't have any that are over 5 times average income. But this is 20 areas. And remember, 16 areas have accounted for the bulk of the growth. The notable areas that are not in that list right now in our area are Nashville, Charlotte, Raleigh, Atlanta. And they've seen their population growth, the influx of folks moving into those areas has all increased pretty significantly. This is GDP numbers by state. Every state in the country has seen economic growth over the last year. This swath, the Midwest, which by and large has an unemployment rate under 3%, but has an older population and doesn't have a lot of population growth, has got slower GDP growth than much of the rest of the country. Strongest growth is out west. And Utah, Nevada, and Idaho have very strong labor force growth in their own right because they have very, very high birth rates, largely due to the Mormon population in those states. And that's allowed them to grow at a sustained high rate. Fastest growth in the country, Orlando, adding about 50,000 jobs a year. We're around 30,000. This is where we are, so we're one of the fastest growing areas in the country. When you look around at that list, and we are certainly one of the fastest growing parts of the country that is not a identified tech area. Because people don't identify Charlotte with tech, even though a lot of the growth that is in Charlotte is tech. We're not readily identified as a tech hub. Looking at job growth, the numbers are quite a bit softer here. Population growth, quite a bit softer here, 1% population growth. This is 2019. I have faith in the census estimates, but generally the census estimates, when you get, even though they have pretty good sampling techniques, when you get in that last 3 or 4 years of the decade, they can be off pretty considerably for a single year. So I wouldn't be surprised to find out that growth in North Carolina was stronger when we get the actual census numbers, provided that we do a good job with the census. But we're still one of the fastest growing states in the country. It's notable, Mississippi and Louisiana. I met with a lot of folks from those two states this past weekend, that growth has been as weak as it's been there. Their economies are not as weak as those population numbers are. This is population growth by percentage since 2010. It's no surprise it's Austin, Orlando, Raleigh there, and then Charlotte right here, which we're in pretty good company. We've got a larger base than a number of the areas that are ahead of us. This is net. This is the absolute numbers, net number of people moving in versus moving out from other states. We are essentially even. We're just a little bit behind Atlanta in terms that Atlanta is about 2.5 times the size of Charlotte. But if you look at the number of people moving to Charlotte versus the number of people moving away, Charlotte has seen about as large a net increase as Atlanta has since 2010, which is pretty remarkable. Don't need to get through all of these. This is growth in the Carolinas. These numbers are going to be revised in late February or maybe even early March, but pretty strong growth here. I mean, this is recovery. A year ago, they had some storm-related damages there that held back employment. This is 3% job growth here using the state's numbers. Raleigh, Cary, and Asheville also really, really high out there, but 3% is pretty strong. This is Charlotte. This is all indexed to the recession. It's kind of interesting. This is Raleigh. Recession was shallower in the Raleigh-Durham area. They have one big advantage, and that is the state government's here. And then they have another big advantage. They got all these universities here. So they have a lot of workers that have tenure, which means in a recession, they just coast on by. And so not as deep as a recession. They recovered all the jobs that were lost in Raleigh, in the Raleigh-Durham area before the end of 2012. Charlotte had a deeper recession than most of the state. I mean, you know, the other areas that I have in here is, this is North Carolina. These are the areas outside of Charlotte and Raleigh, and Charlotte's recession in terms of job losses was actually worse than the state outside of Charlotte and Raleigh. We came back very strong, recovered all the jobs lost in the Charlotte area a year after Raleigh did in 2013. The state of North Carolina, by 2014, the rest of the state, excluding Raleigh and Charlotte, was all the way in 2018, much slower recovery when you got outside of there. Let me just, well, this is the net migration numbers for within North Carolina. You can see Charlotte, Raleigh, Asheville, Wilmington, Durham down here. So it really falls off after you get outside of Charlotte and Raleigh, but the bases on some of those are pretty low. Charlotte job growth, as of November, latest numbers we have, 2.4% versus 2.1%. We're adding jobs in virtually every area. Just, you know, kind of the faults with the government numbers. Does anybody in this room think that we lost construction jobs in the last year in Charlotte? I mean, you know, we did not. And a friend of mine is Ken Simonson. He's the chief economist of the Association for General Contractors. And he says, we've got the largest drop in construction employment of any major metropolitan area in the country. And I said, well, it's just wrong. And sure enough, if you look at the quarterly census of employment numbers, it's a 5% increase, not a 4% decline. And so when you do that, instead of adding 23,000 jobs on net, Charlotte is right around 29,000 net new jobs. So it's a big swing because of that error. Now there's likely some errors on the other side in other places. Most of your tech jobs are right here in professional and business services. And in terms of population growth, we don't have the numbers for 2019. They're not going to be published for several more months. My sense is it's somewhere between 45 and 50,000 based on the numbers that we had from the state. This shows you where the folks come from, net migration, international migration, and natural increase. And until those millennials start getting married, we're not going to get a big bump in that natural increase number. But let me stop there and open it up for questions. There's our tech employment, which is professional and tech services, one measure of it. It's one thing that that number is roughly comparable with what you have in the Raleigh area in terms of raw numbers. And that's measuring it by industry. I think a better way to measure tech employment is to measure it by occupation. So let me stop there and open it up for questions. And feel free to ask about anything that I said or didn't say. Yes?
The population growth. Mark, is the population growth in the West, like Idaho, that you're saying that's really driven a lot because of how expensive their neighbors are in California, Washington, is that right? Or I mean, a lot of that.
That's a big part of it. Now, in some of those areas, like Idaho, Utah, Nevada, have very high birth rates, and so they've got a lot of natural increase.
So Idaho does too.
Much more than the U.S. as a whole does.
Okay.
But what's really been driving them has been a shift in tech jobs around the West as folks are trying to find more affordable places to do business. And it's also places like Salem, Oregon, and Billings, Montana. And I mean, in the West, there's a lot of open space between towns. And so when you get, but it's been the small towns that have been growing the fastest. And then the other thing that's happened in the West is Las Vegas and Phoenix, which were two of the areas that were hit hardest by the housing collapse. And they took longer to recover, and now they're booming right now. And Vegas, you know, they're going to have NFL football next year, and so You know, that's been a big driver for growth. It's kind of a unique situation for.
Say that louder.
Well, NFL's a good driver for growth, but it's a unique situation in Las Vegas because they're really expecting the Raiders fans to travel from California to Las Vegas. So, you know, it's a big tourism economy, and it's kind of an add-on to that, yes.
And so what is driving the population growth in Texas? I think that was the biggest
Texas
number.
is that's been a lot of out-migration from California too. And I did a thing at the ULI, and one of the things that I've done in my job is I was the economist for the Cal Chamber, which was not a paying job. It was in addition to working for Wells Fargo. And in that role, I did a thing where we debated California versus Texas, which was a very hard thing to do. And you know, the economic development recruiter from Austin was there, and he had a stack of RFPs, which are just California companies looking to do business in Austin. It was that high, which, you know, is a great visual. And so I fell back to country music and just said, listen, all your songs about Texas talk about somebody's girlfriend running off with his dog in his truck. I mean, you know, it's like, how good could things be in Texas? But Dallas has been just phenomenal in terms of attracting corporate headquarters. You know, we did very well, and we nearly got Toyota. It wasn't a fair fight. They were 99% sure they were going to Texas, and we were probably their cover bid. And by golly, if you know, it was pretty close. I mean, and I heard that from a good friend of mine who's in their senior management. He said it was really close, but he says the way that Japanese companies work is they have their compensation is kind of a lifetime achievement award, and so they have a lot of older senior management that were going to get paid when they retired. They wanted to be in a state with no income tax, and we have an income tax.
Earlier, you were saying that you had just left an economic development recruitment program for about 50 folks. So can you talk a little bit about what Charlotte's strengths are in the current environment and what some of our challenges are that you think we ought to be aware of as a body?
Yeah, I was just down at Watercolor, which is kind of trying to remember the town that they made the Truman Show. I can't remember what the name of it, Seabreeze maybe, I can't remember. It's a little isolated part of Florida where at the Southern Economic Developers Roundtable. And well, I'm not an economic developer. They all like me. They treat me like one, I guess. But the big issue that everybody was talking about was workforce. Workforce, rural economic development. Those were kind of the big themes at this year's conference. And where I think Charlotte really excels is that we're a city that young college-educated folks want to live at because there's a lot of fun stuff going on here. And so we're attracting lots of great talent. Well, I talked about it a little bit because we had somebody there there's another city that's building a whitewater center, and I can't remember where they were, but I was like, wow. And I said, because I said, you know, when we first built the whitewater center, there were a lot of people that are pretty critical of it, you know, so you know, and I said, and I don't know if we were lucky or good because it just kind of turned out to be a home run, and that's where, I mean, who knew that millennials were going to want to go work up a sweat before they drank lots of beer and they were all going to do it at the same place? You know, it was like nobody knew that when we did it, but it turned out to be just fantastic for us. Soccer is kind of a natural. I mean, it's really it's very popular with young people. I think I think that's another home run for us, and certainly, you know, David Tepper is a home run for us. I mean, you know, it's a guy that, I mean, it's kind of amazing that we get this, we get a soccer team and it's going to take the field before the other two expansion teams do. I mean, that's remarkable. And you know, there's a lot of times when you hear something announced and you don't have a high degree of confidence it's going to happen, but when he got behind this, I said, you know, we're going to get a soccer team. I mean, it's, so, I mean, there's a lot of things that we're doing right. The thing that always scares me, and I don't ever want it to be interpreted as a criticism to UNC Charlotte, because UNC Charlotte's been a huge force for good in the Charlotte area. but we don't have a Duke, we don't have a Stanford, we don't have a Georgia Tech. We don't have that kind of internationally recognized higher education institution. And as I've said to this group, I think we need a tie-in, and University of South Florida is doing exactly what I've been saying. We need to get a tie-in with an Israeli university or some other university around the world that, I mean, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but you know, we could have a cancer center on par with Duke. And our key competitive advantage on that is that we have the airport. And that's the real key competitive advantage. And I'm hoping that the way the medical school with Wake works out to be, but that way. But it doesn't preclude us doing something with another, getting with Ben Gurion University or someone who could also help us in the technology sector too. And and workforce development, I think that we do as well as anybody does in workforce development. But if we can find a way to stand out and to make that a strength, that instead of being as good as everybody else, that we do it better than everybody else, then given the trouble that companies are finding workers, I think that would really put us at a different, at a higher level. And I don't know what all the answers are on that. And it is but we seem to have a lot of the pieces in place. I mean, I know that the community college is a big piece in that, and I can't wait till we finally have I don't even want to call it a streetcar. I'd like to call it light rail that goes on the street. I think that might be, because it certainly, people say streetcar and they think of the trolley, and it's not going to be the trolley. But I think that connecting all of that in together is going to be a big plus. But you know, those are some of the other issue. I mean, you've talked about it a little bit today. You know, crime has become more of an issue, and I don't know. You know, it's potentially could be something that sets us back. And you know, I work with numbers, and so I know that you know that Charlotte's a safe city. But the one thing that I think is changing a little bit is that crime is touching more people, and more people are seeing evidence of it. And where I rented my car to come here, they were tied to one of the tragic events that just happened. And so, you know, it's like, well, gosh, you know, and it gets people talking about it. And that's not what we want to talk about. We don't want that to be the topic of discussion. And one thing, we don't want crime to be there either. But but that's something. I wouldn't say that we're doing worse than other areas. But maintaining a safe city is vitally important. I remember some bad incidents that happened in Atlanta, and you know, it didn't stop Atlanta from becoming the world's next great city, but it did create a speed bump that took them a while to recover from. So, you know, that's one thing that concerns me. But you know, and you know, I will be happy to work with whoever to help do something on the university end and to get out there and push, because I really think we need a partnership, an international partnership, and if we don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. Tampa's done it already. Tampa is one of our peer group cities that is now growing faster than we are, and I wouldn't think that they had all the advantages that Charlotte does.
I don't know if anybody else has a question.
We've had a lot of success recruiting companies, particularly from the Northeast, and we're seeing also now even West Coast and internationally Europe, and a lot of that's due to our ability to, you know, paint the picture of affordability here and cost of living. Also, though, the talent topic and being able to show them that this is where millennials are moving and we have the workforce development capabilities. Any other thoughts from the data you look at as to drivers in that? Also, like, what, you know, how long is that window going to remain open for us? If you think about, you know, particularly New Jersey and that Northeast area where it's been quite easy, to be honest.
Yeah, I would pay a few more calls to New Jersey. I mean, in Connecticut, because I don't think it makes any sense to do business in those states. I mean, right now, I mean, it's like, I mean, if you have an option, I don't, you know, it's like, I think that it's, and probably Chicago too. I think that all of the folks are looking at ways to do business elsewhere. People want to be where folks are moving to though, because they don't want to have to sell their workers on coming to work for them. It's one of the things that surprised me with Amazon's big decision in Northern Virginia, because it's tough to get young people in Northern Virginia. It's tough to get the workers there. I mean, that labor market's tight and it's really expensive. So but you know, Bezos lived there, so I think that was a big part of what did it. In November, I did an event in Atlanta, which was kind of an interesting thing, where suddenly they had woken up to the fact that Nashville was a bit of a competitor, and so it was Atlanta versus Nashville. And they had asked me at the tail end of it, and we talked about the things that were making Nashville grow. And Nashville is growing. They're doing a lot of things. And it's funny is that a lot of these cities that are doing very well, I remember them coming to visit us to see what we were doing right. And you know, they were like, gosh, you need a big financial anchor. They got UBS, and now they got Alliance Bernstein. And you know, well, they soon will. I mean, I don't think they've actually moved there completely, but they've got like a 2.5% unemployment rate. For all the success that Nashville's having and all the buzz that it has, when you looked at those net migration numbers, they're not seeing as many people move there. Housing is very costly in Nashville, and so, you know, we have an edge on that. That's not all of it, but in the case of Atlanta, Atlanta's share of the southeastern economy, both in terms of population, employment, income, has actually grown. So while they're worried about competitors, they've actually gained share in the South, so it's not like they're falling behind. But the other thing about that was kind of interesting is they asked me what other cities might compete with Atlanta. I didn't mention Charlotte because I didn't think it would have gone over very well, because I think I just said that. So I was looking at what the other cities were, and I just ignored Charlotte in that, because maybe we've become too much of a competitor. I was worried about the blowback that I was going to get from them. But the other cities in the South that are kind of there are, you know, the Triangle's doing very well. I mean, when I spoke here last week, I said, if you look at whatever list of what you're measuring, the Triangle's near the top of that list. And I'm wrapping up. I see you're coming to get me, but I'm wrapping up here. The other one is Orlando, which is doing very well, and the space program. And I got to say this, I can't leave without saying this, because the space program is something that a lot of people, when they think about space and they think about going back to the moon, and they hear about Mars, all that stuff is a lot closer and it's a lot more definite. Hypersonic weapons are already with us right now. In order for hypersonic weapons to work, the only two countries in the world that have them are the United States and Russia, because you have to have a viable space program to make them work. We can't relinquish our lead in that. So the space program is a real fast driver for this. I met with a company called BWXT, which Babcock and Wilcox kind of spin-off, used to be in Charlotte a little bit. They're in Lynchburg. They're working on the nuclear propulsion system for the spacecraft that will take us to Mars. You know, the timetable on that is just about the same as the timetable as widening I-77 to the south. And right now, I'm betting on Mars. I'm betting on Mars. I'm betting on Mars, because they're talking about somewhere 2032 to 2034. So it's, you know, it is an interesting one. Now, I'm hoping that we get the bridge, the Hawthorne Bridge, done way before that. But I'm gonna leave it there. But that's one thing. That's one thing that's got an awful lot of growth. Braxton, did you have a question?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I got a few questions. One thing I will say, Mark has been mentioning, and to Mayor Pro Tem's point earlier about continuity over year, Mark has been mentioning this international relationship with the institution, and it's something I think we have all, I can't say we all, but it's something that we've talked about, but we really haven't moved on it at all in the past 2 years. So thank you for, again, mentioning it. maybe there's some way we can.
Well, you know, if there's any way that can help do that, I'll do whatever I can to make that happen.
Likewise. Thank you for coming. Economic numbers don't always tell the entire picture, right? And I hope that we all, as a body, as a policy-making body, we look between those numbers, right? Because economic data, for all the economic numbers you gave us, that doesn't really equate to the quality of life of our constituents, right? A good war will drive those economic numbers up. Poverty is very profitable and drives those numbers up. Natural disasters, as you showed us, drive those numbers up. So they don't really tell us very much without critical analysis of what we're doing necessarily well.
But keep your thought, but let me just counter something. There's no such thing as a good war, okay?
For economic sense, it definitely drives up GDP.
Sometimes they're necessary. They do drive GDP, but there's no such thing as a good war.
I agree. I agree. I'm talking strictly from economics.
Yeah.
You showed during the Vietnam War was one of our longest periods of economic expansion. So I want to dig into these numbers a little bit and what qualify what this means. For instance, you look at this gig economy and it's giving it looks good for employment, but I can tell you from firsthand account and from just looking at the market that gig economy leads to all types of other social impacts and problems. For instance, if Lyft and Uber are your job, you pretty much got to drive like 20 hours a day to make a wage that works in Charlotte. As you talk about these international residents moving into New York City, you also know that is driving natives out of Charlotte out of New York City into places like Charlotte, which leads to our growth and our stronger numbers. But it is also pushing people that live native to Charlotte out. So where are those people going to go? So what are the actual, what is the correlation between kind of some of these wage impacts and these numbers to the actual impact on people? Because what I see is is that while we have expansions in wages on both ends, there's still the possibility of increasing that wage and income gap.
And those are all great points. There has never been a time where we didn't have challenges in the economy. I can't ever remember a time that we didn't. First-time claims for unemployment insurance, the number of people that are newly unemployed is the lowest it's been since the 1960s. And that's great, but it's another number, it reflects real activity. But the question that should go off is that when we have good economic times and we're not making progress at dealing with these persistent issues, we need to ask ourselves, man, if we can't do this when we've got the wind at our back, how are we doing things? How can we change things so we can take advantage of this good opportunity?
But is the wind really at our backs, though? So if you have 2.something% wage increase at the upper levels of income, but you got the 4.1%, is the wind really at the backs of those folks on the bottom, or is that income gap widening? Is it becoming still harder for people to survive, live, and make it?
It is challenging for people at the bottom. It always is challenging for people at the bottom, but right now there's such demand for workers that we're seeing that it's putting some pressure on wages. It's pulling some people into the workforce that wouldn't have had that opportunity before. If we can have the workforce training programs that are in place that can provide a good worker, we're going to attract more businesses at that time. It's going to be good for the workers. It's going to be good for business recruitment because that's where the economy is. So I look at it as an opportunity, but I wish I could tell you just one way we could get it done. There was one thing that we could do, but it involves everything. When I look at our list of advantages in Charlotte, I think that another thing, I mean, we talked about the Whitewater Center, but the more important one was the light rail, which, you know, we may be the last city that's built a light rail system because Nashville turned it down, and Raleigh's going to have a hard time getting it there. That increase in mobility is going to pay off for us.
Is
very,
the
very
wage
well.
gap increasing or is it decreasing?
I don't know, because it depends on how you measure it. There's a good article in The Economist that would suggest that we're actually making some progress at decreasing the wage gap. The problem is when you look at an income gap, an income from all types of sources, so people that are making income off of property, so either through stocks, bonds, or real estate or whatnot. In a rapidly growing economy, the returns on capital are far outstripping that because it's highly cyclical. I mean, they go down 40% in a recession, so they go down a whole lot more during a downturn too. But I would say that the income gap probably widens when the economy strengthens. It probably narrows when we're in recession, which is not necessarily a good thing. But
How much of that lower income range increase can be attributed to minimum wage increases across different states that are coming online now?
It is part of it. And, you know, with the minimum wage and with the gig economy, and I'd like to, if I can finish on both of these, because they're issues that are up front and center in a lot of places. California's got an initiative which is really, it may be addressing at Uber, and I think it's wrong-headed. Uber was started by a group of economists, so I'm a little more sympathetic to the business model. But the idea behind Uber was predominantly for flexibility. It was for, and this is just an example of one situation. So a teacher that teaches 9 months out of the year and has more off time in the summer might drive for Uber in the summer. During the school year, a parent who has a few free hours during the day might drive while their children are in school for a few hours. That was supposed to be 80% of the drivers for Uber or Lyft were supposed to be doing this part-time. Or it might be people that were doing it full-time while they were looking for full-time jobs. Or it might be retirees that were doing it for a couple of days to get off the couch. I know that I meet lots of people that are doing that, but to do it as a means of support, and that's not what it was intended to do. The advantage of Uber is that your typical car is only used 4% of the time. So you've got an asset, a depreciating asset that's not generating any income, and you've got people that have some free time, and so this is, if you think back to economics, what we're talking about doing is the production possibilities curve. And what the gig economy has done is it's pushed the curve out. And when you push the curve out, the example they use is guns and butter, you get more of both. And so the standard of living for the entire country benefits. So if we're going to have limits on the gig economy, we don't want to limit it in a way that would slow its growth. The same thing with the minimum wage. I have no problem at all with raising the minimum wage, but I do think we should have a lower wage for seasonal workers. We shouldn't make it impossible for Carowinds to operate. We should have a lower wage for teenagers. I mean, I insist, you know, my son turned 16, he went to Harris Teeter, he went and got a job. Because I believe that the skills that you learn as a teenager to show up for work, to listen to somebody other than your father, and I think that pays off for your entire life. There should be it's great. If he goes to work at Target, they start at $13 an hour. You know, I think that's great. I think that there's fewer opportunities that are going to be created when the wages get that high, and they're probably not going to be as interested in hiring a teenager who's going to work 6 months and then stop for 6 months and work 6 months. So we want to create, if we raise the minimum wage, we want to raise it in a way that maintains a lot of flexibility in the labor market and doesn't limit opportunities. But raising the minimum wage, there is room for raising the minimum wage.
The question was, what does that? You mentioned that higher rate of growth among lowest income ranges of 4.16%. What is the correlation between the rise?
I'm sorry. There is a relationship, I believe. I mean, and it's too soon to know it definitively, but I do believe that there is a correlation. As I mentioned, it has this shift from full-service restaurants to fast casual is most evident in California and Los Angeles. And so folks are, there are fewer jobs being created in the leisure and hospitality industry. I mean, 160,000 fewer over the last year, but the jobs that are being created tend to pay more. So that's what's, so I do think that the higher minimum wages had something to do with that. But that's, and so it's kind of a value judgment in a economy that's got a 3.5% unemployment rate that may not be an issue.
But again, those numbers don't really tell the whole story about employment and the relationship to people.
I know. To me, in my 30-something years as an economist, the best way to get work experience is to work. I mean, that is the best way to get trained and get skills is to work. And, you know, the number one quality that employers in North Carolina that they say is lacking in the folks that they interview is work ethic. That is the number one skill. That's something we can address. That's what I'm addressing with my son and my children with getting a job. My youngest is 15. She's chomping at the bit to go work at Starbucks. And they're just like their dad. They want to work somewhere that they can walk to, you know. So it's, but it's, you know, work ethic and the way that you address work ethic is getting into the labor market. And so if we limit opportunities for people to get into the labor market, then I think we're making the problem worse. Is getting them in, and then having opportunities. I mean, one of the ideas, and I mentioned this the last two times, and when you're saying about the consistency. It's another idea that I've had, and again, I'd be happy to help with this. I don't know if it's beyond my realm, but I've always talked about it would be so beneficial if we had a festival of learning, you know, if we expanded Novello to talk about learning. And to me, it would be more like a local international fair, job fair that had, not job fair necessarily, but you had all your major employers talk about the technologies that they use. I mean, if you had someone from the hospital talk about how an MRI machine works and what it takes, because I think there's a huge gap between children that are growing up today and the opportunities that are being presented to them. And by the time they find out about those opportunities, they're in their 20s, they've moved beyond their traditional schooling age, and they feel like it's too late for them to pivot because they're involved in too many other things. And I think that if we did that, just with the companies that are here, I think it would work with workforce development, and I think it would make more people aware of more opportunities. It would and add to that work ethic, because they would know what it would take to get those jobs. I mean, that's something that I think it could move something that's one of our biggest challenges to being one of our greatest strengths.
And with that, can we thank Mark for spending time with us this morning? So folks, here's the deal. Lunch is already out there. We're going to take a 15-minute break. We'll reconvene. We'll start our panel discussion at 12:47.
This table's got
I'll put a clock up on the screen so you'll know when we'll reconvene. So Katie, we got a clock going?
Should I put it in the parking lot? Or?
You gotta find a way to put it on the board, because I can't execute unless you guys put it on the board.